You got it.
Yeah.
Let's turn off. They're in order, so it's Nick who's second, who's your third, Aaron's last. It was in an attachment they sent there. It was a multi-page attachment. Would they control sound like turn on?
So are you going Yeah.
I live in Maryland,
Yeah.
There is a 12 miles away and it will take me an hour and a half. I got here really bright. I got early in the morning. I started to do it in 40 minutes. They can build, so you can build this area. And they still have lanes along there's some places where all of a sudden there's a restaurant and like it's pretty insane to sit there and find something that's the old restaurant. Why not just sit there and everybody's talking about it's just so the worst reason is Maryland and Virginia. Like any place it's like there was here, and as things move, artisans of why people don't want No, me neither.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Aaron Klein. I'm the Miriam K. Carliner Chair and Senior Fellow in Economic Studies here at the Center of Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution. Breath after all of that. And it is a testament to everyone in this room and to the importance of the topic at hand that this many people are in Washington on a Friday morning to sit around and talk about artificial intelligence and financial stability. I want to thank you all, the stalwarts of this two-day conference as we open up the second day in the much less august room here at Brookings. Let me give you a little bit of a roadmap for today because we're going to do things a little differently today. The morning will be a bit of the standard panels, keynote panel. Then we will break for lunch. Then we are going to have 3 breakout rooms where the cameras will have stopped rolling, and we're going to have a conversation to harness the power of the ideas and the experience of people in this room. All of that will be conducted under Chatham House rules, at which point we will then reconvene for the true stalwarts to all be in one large room at the very end of the day to share our experiences from the breakout rooms and engage in a larger conversation. So with that as a roadmap, and we promise to get you out of here around 2 o'clock before the Friday summer traffic situation resumes. So with that as a roadmap for day 2, I want to just highlight a couple things. As you saw by the blog post that Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary Lee and I wrote, one of the reasons we're calling this conversation and this conference together is to harness the ideas that exist throughout the sector of regulation, of the various elements of the private enterprise engaged in this, and the public consumer advocacy to get to the core questions of how can artificial intelligence improve financial stability and how can it threaten financial stability. I like to have thought that it wouldn't have required an intelligence beyond human capacity to see that in 2007, we'd had 2 years in American history where not a single bank had failed. After a period where there'd never been 1 year in all of American history without a single bank failure. I would have liked to have think that with the home price appreciation that we'd seen and the idea that 1,000 subprime mortgages wrapped together would be AAA credit risks and derivatives of the non-AAA portions packaged together had infected the financial system at such a level it wouldn't have taken a machine beyond human capability to come in and say we had a huge threat to the financial system. I am often reminded of a hearing we held where I was in 2007 at the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, where we talked about the potential of a foreclosure crisis. There was a witness, Martin Eakes, from the Center for Responsible Lending, who said that there'd be 2 million foreclosures and a tsunami of problems in the housing finance market. He was laughed out of the room. He was laughed out of the room because the regulators had been telling us banks had never been safer, as witnessed by the lack of any failures. 5,000 banks. Nobody's failing. How could you say that there are any problems? Now, Martin was wrong. 2 million was way an undercount. It was closer to 5. And a year and by 2 years later, any human intelligence would have told you that the financial system was incredibly shaky in January of 2007. Would an AI have done anything different? Had regulators been incorporating AI, would there have been a different response? Would we have detected it beforehand? And had we gone through it, would an artificial intelligence have guided us a little bit differently? We'll never know. But what we do seem to know is the next time there's a financial crisis, artificial intelligence will be enmeshed into various aspects of both the financial system and potentially the regulatory monitoring apparatus. Now, in all of that context, we had to come up with just 4 panels and just a few keynotes, and then we'll have 3 breakouts later today to try and touch different elements of the parable of the village, of the group of blind people touching the elephant, trying to understand collectively what it is. And so with one of those panels here today, we're going to look at a topic that's one of my favorite topics, which is data quality. Because at the end of the day, one of the core questions as it relates to both human and artificial intelligence is the ability to see beyond data. I'll close by noting that there's a robust debate about when artificial intelligence occurred and when it didn't. One argument in that debate is to look at a movement in a game called Go. I think it was called Go 37. Did I get that? Or Go 73? Do you guys know the moment I'm talking about? Do you guys know the game Go? It's an ancient Asian game. I think it's orders of magnitude more complicated than chess. And there was a computer playing a Go master, and the computer made a move that a child wouldn't have made. And people thought the computer model was broken. And the master was a little surprised. And it turned out it was one of the most insightful moves. And some people have said that was the moment where a computer went beyond its data set, because nowhere in recorded Go had anybody made a move that seemed that foolish at a high level to be worth the data set. And the computer saw around the corner. And the question then becomes, if computers can see beyond data sets, what does that mean for the quality of the data set that we're looking at? How do you even judge that? What constitutes good data? What constitutes bad data? And how does the quality of that data affect the quality of our output? So for that, I'm going to call Stacy Schreff up to the stage, as well as the fellow panelists, which in a late addition due to an illness will include myself. And we will have a conversation. Stacy, come on up. I'll let her introduce everybody, and I'll introduce. She's a deputy director, the Office of Financial Research, where she comes from an illustrious career through the Federal Reserve System, the PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota, go Twins, and a degree from Smith College. So with that, let's kick off the panel. Stacy, it's yours.
Great, thank you. It struck me yesterday that my friend Susan Baker opened the first panel talking about the very, positive aspects of AI. Well, this panel is called Bad Data, Bad Output. And as I told the organizers, they had me in when they had that title. And I thank Aaron for the introductory remarks, because he started that darker vibe that this panel might have. It really depends on where the panelists take it. The bad data problem has many dimensions to it. There's data corruption. You can have that from malicious purposes like data poisoning, or inadvertent ones, where like chatbots, as I think an example was yesterday, are just generating lots of content, accurate or not, and spitting it out, or where you have bias in models that lead to lending decisions so that your lending results end up having bias in them. You can have data leakage. So you have maybe good data, but nobody has the right to be using it, and that can be malicious from a data breach, or it can be inadvertent, where a query to some AI model ends up having the model reveal information that it shouldn't. And of course, then there's just the plain old traditional data integrity issues, dirty data, data not fit for purpose, or fit for some purpose, but we don't necessarily understand how it's not fit for this purpose. And then there's just the fake data too. So I am joined here, there are probably many other dimensions to the bad data problem, and I'm joined here by a rock star panel. Next to me is Nick Reed, Chief Product Officer of Moody's. We have Anuj Malik, partner at Ernst & Young, and as Aaron said, Len Kennedy from the Cornell School of Law was supposed to join us and is under the weather, and we hope he gets better soon, but Aaron has graciously volunteered to step in. Okay, so I am just the moderator, and I'm not here to give my own views, but if I slip, they are just mine and not necessarily those of any organization with which I'm affiliated. And so with that, I'm going to start the questions, and I aim to stop a little early to take questions from the audience, but then I'm going to end that early, so don't get too excited, because I reserve the right to ask the last question. Okay, so I thought we could start with a foundational question. So I talked about some of the dimensions of bad data. How big a problem is bad data, do each of you think, and which part of it worries you the most? And I thought we could just go down the row and you could take some time to answer.
Thanks, Stacey. I don't necessarily think of it as being a problem, but this is, I guess, a contextual question. So if we're talking about foundational models or large language models, for example, then in that context, knowing what they are and what they're for might change the way in which you answer this question. And so I think of them as being language engines as opposed to knowledge retrieval engines. Unfortunately, they're being used as knowledge retrieval engines. And in that context, bad data equals bad outputs. And so I think of it as being much more a training, education, and usage problem rather than necessarily a core issue that relates to things like LLMs or foundational models. And I know in the context under which we use them and our customers use them, primarily what we're focused on is attempting to convince people what they are, talk about what they are, and supplement the fact that actually they're not really designed as knowledge retrieval engines. As long as you use them in that context, then you'll be completely fine. And in that context, I don't know that bad data is the way that I would describe it, because mostly it's about consuming as much data as possible. I would kind of say good, bad, or indifferent, because bad data in that context are going to be, thousands and millions of attributes compared to trillions and trillions of attributes when it comes to just being able to predict the next word. But if you're using it to try and find out a particular answer, in our context, if you wanted to find out what the rating of Tesla was, and you go to ChatGPT, it will tell you something. I guarantee that it won't be right, because it's just picking what the next letter might be or the next word might be in that context. And so our focus is on making sure that we can supplement those LLMs with something that actually is accurate. In fact, the industry is really focused on saying, how do we make sure we use foundational models for what they're good at, which is producing text that's consumable and reducing barriers to entry to markets, but not as retrieval engines. So I guess that's kind of my contextual answer.
Thank you, and thanks for the Treasury as well as the Brookings for having us here. I'd kind of maybe take what Nick said down a level even further, right? So when we talk about contextualization, a lot of times what we're talking about is essentially this one AI thing that's sitting by itself, and we're worried about what's going into it and what's coming out of it. But really what we're seeing out there that's being built, if you look at the use cases, if you look at how firms are using it, is actually an ecosystem, right? It's an ecosystem of big data or data that's coming together in a pipeline that's then feeding some daisy chain of a predictive model or a discriminative AI, as instead of traditional AI as we heard about yesterday, into generative AI potentially if there's a use case for it. And that ecosystem is also augmented by humans. So when we think about that complete system, right, when we think about the data only going into specifically a model, yes, there is most definitely some things that we'll talk about today around model-centric behavior versus data-centric behavior that we should really think about. But when we think about it kind of big picture, it's about how we're using it today. And the way we're using it today in a lot of the pragmatic ways that firms are applying it is actually that ecosystem where we do have what you heard yesterday around human-in-the-loop capabilities. We do have in it a lot of testing and validation and tuning that's happening in it. So yes, data in and of itself as an individual element or set most definitely is a critical component, and quality is absolutely important. However, when we look at what's being put out there as a solution, it's an ecosystem solution and is a daisy chain solution, and it's something that we've got to look at as to how we protect that ecosystem to be able to have increase the confidence of it.
So I'm terrified. And I'm terrified for several reasons. First, there's that little rule of thumb that half the data stored is over the last 5 years, right? And you kind of hear that evergreen statistics. Well, think about that. The 80% of the last 5 years is COVID and post. And that data hopefully is not what the next 25 years of my life will look like, right? Two, the quantity of data is astounding. And as a recovering statistician, the law of large numbers allows, with so much data, the potential for the more data you have in a way, the easier it is to draw a wrong inference, because you have so many different variables where you just need slight distinctions between those variables to drive a result as your sample, as your n gets larger. And in this situation, you can find things that the human easily throws out, right? So 25, 30 years ago, when you were trying to show this in a linear regression context, you would show a univariate regression, right? One variable to predict the performance of the stock market was whether the National Football Conference or the American Football Conference won the Super Bowl. And that was deeply predictive from 1973 until 1996, right? it would not take a sports fan to understand that the winner of the Super Bowl should not have any correlation to the stock market, but you get a really high R squared. You could pass statistical significance in many different ways. If you put those different words on that, you could get it published in an academic journal by meeting statistical criteria. Now, that was, whoever came up with that was a wonderful teaching tool. But now you have a computer. Why would they think, well, maybe that has an impact? So at the same time, the computer can find true things that kind of are a little bit interesting and unique. The ability to find false positives has risen exponentially. And at what level are we going to be able to have the insight necessary to distinguish between the false positives that come out of all this statistical computing power and the true positives, which were insights that did not naturally occur to us? And I'm not sure how to see the answer to that.
Okay, so we have a range of views from our panelists and in terms of how bad they think the problem is. And Nick, while he doesn't think it's as bad, basically burst the bubble of the AI evangelists out there. So, how do we identify, how do we even know how bad our data are, and what measures constitute best practices for trying to clean the data? Who wants to grab that one?
So I think if I were to take a little bit of what Aaron said in terms of being terrified, when I go into one of our clients to help them with an AI problem, what I'm terrified by from a data perspective is actually not enough data, right? So a lot of times what we're looking at in terms of statistical significance, if you will, or in terms of being able to understand the ability to actually validate against false positives, as Aaron talked about, is how much data is there. And the key here, and I'll give you an example of something we did recently. We had a year's worth of data, and you think a year's worth of data would be great for us to be able to utilize. But actually, what it did was it gave us a little bit of the thresholds as to what we needed to look at from a statistical perspective. But it didn't give us anything around seasonality. It didn't give us anything around behavioral variability. It didn't give us anything around the differing the fluctuations that might happen, if you will, depending on large events or small events. And so really one of the kind of key things around bad data is actually not enough data and not well-labeled data, right? However, in and of itself, data is the data that we have today, right? It is what we have to start with and what we have to use. So how can we improve that data? And that's one of the things that we want to talk about is how do we use potentially AI to potentially improve the statistical nature of that data itself?
Just out of interest, by show of hands, who knows what RAG is? That's good. RAG is a technique used by the industry to make up for the fact that it's an almost impossible task to validate and test the output of an LLM. In fact, I would argue that it's a waste of time because the LLM is something that exists, that's going to produce words, and that whilst there's a necessity to make sure that there's, I'll call it, robustness in the environment or the technical environment in which you use LLMs, actually testing the output of an LLM seems kind of ridiculous. You're just testing that words exist and that words have been created based on probability of the next best word, whereas RAG is a technique, so for those people that don't know, it's retrieval augmented generation, which is essentially saying, how do I use a foundational model which is really good at natural language to understand the question, if you like, the prompt or the intent, and then what sources am I going to use to augment the answer because I'm interested in a really specific outcome. And so the quality of that augmentation is the thing that we like testing, because then you're really saying, well, in this particular use case, how do I test whether the answer that I got, because it's now been augmented by some data set that I do trust, that is clean, that hasn't been subject to just language probability, but is much more likely to be a knowledge retrieval engine, is augmenting the response. And then how do I test that that response provides me something that's useful, particularly for decision-making processes? Again, I'm really talking about the context of getting something useful that I'm going to be able to use to make a decision, as opposed to summarizing a document or using it just as a language engine itself.
So one of the reasons I'm very concerned about how you can ever possibly figure out how to cleanse the quality of this information is a combination of a hypothesis I can't prove with an insight I've had, right? So the insight is that all financial crises are the combination of the fundamental mispricing of an asset with leverage. And you can have bubbles with one of those two, but in order to have a crisis, you must have both. So leverage, there's a lot of ways to figure that one out. What is the true price of an asset? Well, you know, when the internet came, what was the price of a click, right? We didn't know we had a bubble. Luckily, we didn't have leverage because we didn't allow people to go in the stock market on margin because that regulation from the Depression hadn't been repealed, right? What is the value of our real estate market? You would think that that would have been a knowable asset price, but we got that one wrong in 2007-8. And when you get it wrong on the upswing of a market, it's very hard to be the one who says, no, I think we've overpriced this value of the asset. Even, you know, click on the internet, that was brand new, who the heck knew, right? What the value of my condo in Silver Springs should not have been implausible to calculate, yet the leverage and the expectation of that valuation and the inability of all of the condos just like mine around the country to go down simultaneously confounded the model space. So the ability to challenge one of these things in the financial stability context is very difficult. Flip side, data. I have a hypothesis. I do a lot of work on financial health and well-being. I have a hypothesis that the schedule of our paychecks does not align well with the schedule of our medicine. I've yet to meet a doctor who writes you a prescription and asks you when is your payday. So my hypothesis is lower income people have a discrepancy between when they can afford to refill their prescription and when the prescription runs out and when their pay period is. I've gotten lots of transactional data to try and show some change about when you go. And I can't do it, in part because I don't know. I can know when you buy at CVS and how much, or the pharmacy, but I don't know whether you're buying food, groceries, or a prescription pill. Do I really know when your paycheck hit? You know, sometimes you see people buy things on Sunday, it gets posted Monday, right? All this like little, when you actually start trying to clean up this data, right? And how do I know your deposit is your paycheck and not, you know, especially if you're not, say, direct deposit, auto-enrolled, stable government employee, but you're getting, you know, your side hustle, you're this, you're that. It becomes incredibly difficult. But if you have enough data, the quantity of it, the model will spit something out. And so the model will produce an answer regardless of the human in the loop. Now, you may say that there's a human breaking it now. But that's why I don't know how to clean up the data, and I don't know how in the upswing of the euphoria of the mispricing, how the model won't contribute to that.
Okay, so none of you mentioned AI cleaning up the data itself. And I've read that some people think that's going to be the solution here. I personally can't get my head quite around that because, you know, for example, you know, it's supposed to be good at anomaly detection, and we might want it to clean out bias. But if we don't know the bias is there, then data without the bias is the anomaly. So what is the hope of AI cleaning up its own, up the data for us? And if not AI, then how do we get better at it?
There's a bit of a slippery slope argument here, by the way. So we use AI tools and techniques to be able to understand the quality of data, to supplement the quality of data, and to create synthetic data. And so, like I said, that's a bit of a slippery slope because at some point in time, being able to differentiate the tools that we used and the outputs that were produced in a data set that blends those three concepts together becomes a little problematic. Again, we kind of recognize that there's the potential for issues. At the moment, we're much more focused on using these kinds of tools for anomaly detection and for providing insight into where there are areas of concern or where we might need to change the amount of interest a model has in a particular data set, for example, as opposed to just saying, if we wanted to, we can probably click some buttons and generate a whole bunch of synthetic data. But again, we recognize that that's probably not going to then provide future outputs that give us any level of confidence. So again, ask me again in 3 years' time when everyone has automated agents that's just going and scraping all of this stuff and producing a whole bunch of synthetic data, I'd be a little nervous too.
Yeah, so if I were to take it a step further in terms of what Nick said, I couldn't stress the importance of this. Even in a lot of the conversations yesterday, there were, there's a clear need for a taxonomy, a way to be able to describe what these things are. Because quite honestly, what we're talking about in terms of, for instance, what the technology companies are producing are essentially a model for a method. Right, a large language model is a method, or various types of machine learning is a method, and there's a model for that. And then there's the model on top of that, which is, let's say, what a bank would build in order to do the anomaly detection and the data that's associated with that. And there, they would pull data from third-party sources. They would have their own data. They'd have data that's potentially, to your point, synthetically generated, right? And then off the back of that, they would generate outputs. Now, again, generating that output from an AI, is that actually data itself that you need to think about as real data, or is that not real data? And that's a whole other area that we've got to think about as to what that is. And to Aaron's point earlier, right? Does that actually constitute potentially us creating some issues? But if we were to go back down to how do you clean it up? There are generally what we look at when we think about AI is we think about that model-centric approach, as in like how do we fit data around a model? How do we look at the data around a model? However, I think there's a shift now towards potentially merging that with a data-centric approach. So the idea essentially is that you're taking that model-centric approach, then you're taking the data-centric approach, and you're bringing it together where once you've trained the model, you're actually doing the validation, the testing, the tuning, and you're understanding where potentially you have spikes and flats in your data, where you have noise in your data, and you're going back in and you're using AI techniques to be able to potentially either ignore those or fix those, or even go back to human sources and be able to augment those. Right? And those are techniques that are happening and essentially will help improve the quality of the data. The second is, and we're the highest, if you will, use of our time right now in the market is around building AI-ready data pipelines, right? And so AI-ready data pipelines, and absolutely critical for us, is that there's some data that is ready for AI versus there's some data that is potentially just out there and you don't know how to use it. So what data should you use? Should that be in a pipeline? Is it repeatable? Are you getting it from the same source? Is it a trusted source? Those data pipelines, and a lot of companies are investing down that path, essentially allow you to be able to start to have that more trusted corpus of data that you're going to utilize for purposes that you're going to take to production, right? And then the last two things, and we talked about this a lot yesterday, was domain-based testing and domain-based tuning. Right? Both of those things absolutely critical, because from a testing perspective, if an engineer was to test it versus if somebody from the domain was to test it and validate that the outcome is there, yes, we're not going to figure out the edge cases. We're not going to figure out what we don't know. That's most definitely the case, but we don't do that today. Right? But that domain-based testing and then that domain-based tuning as to what's the language that you use in your domain and is that outcome right? And then also tuning for the edge cases, as in, for instance, the racial biases, the gender biases, et cetera, making sure that you're starting to get to that. That's where you're building an ecosystem around the data and not just the model and the data alone. That'll help you kind of increase the confidence in it.
So I'm an economist, which means that I do two things, right? One, I think a lot about incentives. Two, I try to bully other people by the use of math, often poorly, but if I can be bullying enough about my poor math, maybe I can get through without being challenged enough. So one, the incentive here is to say I've cleaned more data and my data works better than it does. Everybody has that incentive. In all of these things, the skunk in the room who keeps saying we can't go forward with this, the data isn't clean enough, right? It's a lonely voice to be, right? You look at some of the regulatory things about the junior people who raised questions about Silicon Valley Bank, who were then left out of the next meeting as the issue rose up. That's a classic problem in any organization. When I was young and thinking more about a period in academic economics, I started reading all these papers that use in fancy economic journals that used averages of ordinal rankings. Have any of you guys ever done that mathematical technique? Do you know what I mean? Do you guys know what, right? On a survey of 1 to 10, please rate your experience. Uber uses surveys of ordinal rankings, right? The difference between a 4 and a 5 star for me is different than for many of you in this room. And the difference between a 2 and a 3 star is not the same as the difference between a 4 and a 5 star. That's an integer. One of the rules of integers is that the difference between any two integers is identical. right? Any two numbers next to each other on the number line, subtract, it's 1. Elementary school math. When you take the average, that works for integers. It doesn't work for ordinal rankings. A 5-star trip is better than a 4-star trip, but your 4-star trip could be my 3-star trip. When I started taking Uber, I gave everybody 4 because I was only going to give the greatest people 5 until I realized the collective societal ranking is to give everybody a 5-star. And anything below 5-star is kind of a little, and so what did I know? I didn't realize that I'm tuned to a different string in the universe than you guys in terms of how to do these rankings. But we average these things. You can't average ordinal data. That's really bad math. And I went to my advisor, and he said, well, we just have a bunch of ordinal data, Aaron. And we have a bunch of papers we need to write. And are you really sure you can't do this? I'm like, yeah, you can. He's like, well, but the numbers, they kind of work, and I sit around, we can compare our Uber ratings, right? I'm 483. Some of you guys are higher. Some of y'all are lower, right? Is that an apt comparison or not? So what terrifies me in this context is the incentive is to clean the data, and the incentive at a societal level isn't to peer too deeply into the statistical techniques that we use as long as we're liking their outcome. And as long as we're liking that outcome tends to be correlated with as long as the market is going up. And that's where you start to get the financial stability risk. And it's where I struggle to see the incentives lining up to counterbalance the rush to use this too much.
So the one thing I do want to challenge around what Aaron said is that when we actually, for instance, go out there and look at a specific AI use case and a problem, we don't actually just pick one model and then throw data at it and say, okay, let's get the outcome. Well, whenever we've done it, we've actually looked at multiple models, thrown data at those multiple models, compared those multiple models, understood thresholds at different levels, understood clustering, and seen if this clustering is statistically relevant to us or not. So there is most definitely the issue around what Aaron's talking about, as in if people aren't doing those things, aren't using testing correctly, aren't using validating correctly, aren't actually doing tuning correctly, which requires education, in my opinion, of our general, not just the scientists in the room, but everybody. Then we're definitely going down that wrong path. However, if we're using the techniques that are available to us to improve the quality, I think it's important. The other thing is now we know why Uber doesn't pick up Aaron.
We do. Since he used that example, I thought, Aaron, we were always supposed to rate drivers a 5, so we get rated a 5 or they don't pick you up.
Different incentive model.
Right. Right. So there's your reciprocity incentive, which is very different because the ratings are done before we know each other's ratings. I assumed a 4 was a really good pickup. Right? Just because, but when we do these types of things, right, you can't get anywhere in economics trashing ordinal rankings. Where's the paper saying everybody else's paper uses bad math, right? Where's the model out there saying everybody else's model is wrong? A few people in counterintuitive space can make a big killing in the market, but the government certainly of the last person can go in and say everybody's ranking is wrong. When we tried to do that in Dodd-Frank, right, we tried to say the regulators couldn't use credit rating agencies, and they all found a way around it. And they still do, even though the law says you can't.
So let's talk about missing data and the spotlight problem. Let's suppose that our data are squeaky clean. We still have the problem that the data only reflect the past. They're the only things that have happened before. And so if our models are just looking and working with that data, this is not an AI problem. It's always been a problem with quantitative models. You only can work with what's in the data that you have. But, are we condemning ourselves to make decisions from models that are predicting based on patterns of the past, and how are we going to deal with that spotlight problem?
This is kind of reinforcing, I guess, of the point that I was making earlier about understanding what they are and understanding usage patterns, because a big complaint, if you like, about the use of ChatGPT is that it'll always tell you the date around which it was accurate, as if to suggest it was accurate at March 2024. And so therefore, whatever information was contained in the model by March 2024 is right. And what it's saying is that was the last time I ingested a whole bunch of words. And so it's creating this false sense of its purpose and use, where the answer isn't, well, if you just meant that you consumed all of the data right up to date, it would somehow be accurate. That would make up for this fact. Again, it's kind of reinforcing in my mind of the need to be able to drive education and learning and training around what these models are, one of the nervousnesses that we have is it's a bit of a kind of two sides of the same coin. So we really like the idea of lowering the barrier to entry to markets. And things like large language models lower the barrier to entry because to operate in the financial market, you used to need to be able to speak the language of finance. And now you don't. You can use natural language to interact with the financial markets. Except all of the structures in the financial markets have an expectation about your knowledge and ability to interact in those markets. And so suddenly we've got this disparity where you've got people that think that they can act and operate in a certain way because they can use the language that they know in a market that hasn't yet worked out how to define what its boundaries are, what its guidelines are, what its training and educational approaches are. And so, again, we think they're a nervous little period where you've got this disparity between those two approaches.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the key things that we have to get towards is a little bit of that distinction between potentially the idea of it being static versus being dynamic. So, for instance, and this is one of those areas that we have, I believe, generally seen underinvestment in. So when we actually talk to our clients, we're talking to them about their strategy, their use cases, how are they going to build, what their platforms are, what their AI pipelines are, all of that. But one area that we don't hear a lot of today is AI ops or ML ops. And the whole idea essentially behind that is that once you put something in place, it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect, and it's never going to be static. So the whole idea is that could you, using AI ops, start to go down the path of seeing, hey, is this a self-learning problem, and do we actually just turn off the self-learning feature and keep it static? How do we look at the drift that's happening in the way that the AI answered the question last time versus the AI answered the question this time, or predicted an outcome that time versus this time? And the AI ops component of it, which is essentially monitoring that at the use case level, is one element of AI ops that allows you to be able to make sure that you're keeping and maintaining and building those components in a way that you're able to adjust, maintain, update, and to Nick's point, also understand if there's net new data, do you actually version it and get to the next version and the next version? Because again, if you look at, and I actually hate using ChatGPT as an example, primarily because it's created this false narrative that that's the AI that's out there, that's what's next, but that's not what's next, right? When you actually dig deeper, you actually see a very different set of outcomes that are out there in the financial sector and in the private sector, but they have versions. There's a 3.4 and a 3.x and a 4 point something, right? They're versions of this, and so how do you actually use AI ops to be able to go down that path? And then the last component of this, which I think is something that we also have to think about, is to what extent does then that AI ops need to be different from how we do operations today, right? How we do operations today is somebody in the back office is doing your operations, but is operations today more about the involvement of business, the involvement of domain experts, in not just the building side of it, but also in the maintaining side of it? Because quite honestly, like if you asked me to be able to maintain something in the mortgage market, that'd be great. I could help you with some parts of that, but I wouldn't have the context of, is this actually telling me the right answer or the wrong answer? So how do we start to build in more business expertise in the AI ops side as well?
Okay. I want to make sure we talk about governance. And this came up, trust and governance came up in some of the talks yesterday. About a month ago, I was at a conference on AI and the financial sector, and I heard Brian Selesky, the CEO of Stack, which does autonomous trucking solutions. And he was talking about how all the studies of humans and self-driving cars show that when technology works, people trust it and they disengage, but we have not succeeded in getting people to re-engage when they need to. And of course, that makes perfect sense, because to re-engage, you have to be continuously monitoring to know when to re-engage, and that means you didn't trust and disengage in the first place, which questions whether it's a great self-driving car. So I want you to hold to that thought of trust and complacency as I ask, what role does the board of directors have in oversight of the use of AI to mitigate the risk from bad data? Are boards of directors up to the challenge? And in particular, let's suppose AI is considered a success, being it's improving corporate earnings, reducing costs. It works. right? From a board's perspective and the C-suite's perspective, it's working, and no one's going to want to give that up. That can induce complacency. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me go and start, because you mentioned the self-driving and trust, and this is a huge question. I want to ask everybody in the audience, if you could do this tomorrow, everybody self-drove, and over the next 365 days, 10,000 people will die driving. Who does it? Show of hands. Okay, same question. However, over the next year, there'll be a 75% reduction in the number of fatalities. Who moves everybody to self-driving? Okay, I just asked the same question twice, right? Now, I know that 80% of people rate themselves as above average drivers, myself included. I have no idea how good a driver you are, although I've noticed my car, my brand new car, kind of doesn't think I'm a very good driver, because it's always telling me to take a little break. And so I think the AI is going to come back and tell me I'm not as good a driver as I think I am. And so the questions that we have in these things are, how much do we trust the computer is correlated with a combination of how much do we have overconfidence in ourselves, coupled with the delta between this expectation of an ideal outcome versus the logic of marginal improvement. And if you substitute in any set of discriminatory factors, you run into a similar problem that we have in a lot of consumer finance law, where you have a status quo that's been grandfathered to a level of acceptance that's very different than what the law or what society would tend to allow. Layered on top of that is a sensationalism. I think I've read a story about every single self-driving car that's had an accident. And yet I blur through the 17 accidents on WTOP driving into the morning, because now I don't even need to know, because my AI, Google, will tell me how to drive around them in that context. And so I am very deeply nervous about how we govern this. And I think a lot of the problem is this delta between the reality of marginal improvement, which I noticed from my vantage point, I would say about 20% of people in the room were good with marginal improvement, and about 60% of people in the room, were good. Sorry, something, and so it's the framing of all of that where you can get these very disparate outcomes, and I don't necessarily see how policymakers are going to be able to handle a world in which there's such a difference of opinion depending on how the question is framed, coupled with the fact that whatever the AI mistakes are going to be amplified relative to the successes.
I think if I were to take Aaron's example here, and I think it's a really critical one about life and death, right? And if we talk about financial stability, that's really what we're here for, right? So let's talk about AI in that lens as well. One of the key differences we have to draw out is AI, excuse me, in the line of the transaction versus AI that's not in the line of the transaction. And the key thing here is if you're actually, if you will, using AI for the actual trade, or you're using AI, for instance, for reconciliation in a post-trade for a match purpose, for instance, right? To increase efficiency, increase productivity, potentially improve how you're going to look at regulations out there and be able to map to those regulations and improve your controls. Those are not in the line of transaction, versus what's in the line of transaction is when you're actually making a transaction that could potentially impact financial risk, financial stability in the market, and have some of that, if you will, compounding impact of what we saw with 08. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of being able to look at governance, and I think kind of going back to your point around board, C-suite, but not just C-suite, but essentially leaders in the organization, is making that distinction as to where do you need to govern? What's your blast radius of the AI? Is it internally facing, or is it facing the customer? Is it making a decision for the customer, or is it making a decision internally that allows you to be able to operate more effectively? That blast radius as to what you should govern shouldn't be this broad brush that you're stroking across all your AI, but should actually be focused on those areas that actually have that impact. And I think that's one of the critical things. Like, to your point, self-driving cars are not out there on the street. And I think Tesla's turned off the feature in some of their models because it can kill people, versus, you know, the little feature that looks at your eyes and says, hey, you should really pay attention. That's also some kind of AI. It's using vision AI to be able to do that. And that's not in the line of the transaction, so it's actually helping you actually stay more alert. And these are key distinctions to be able to call out, especially in the financial services industry.
I can tell you our board of directors is pretty focused on responsible usage, I guess is the easiest way to describe it internally, and responsible consumption externally. So their focus of governance is less specifically on the technology or the models, but on the usage of the technology and the models, in part because the technology is moving so fast that it would be really hard to attempt to try and govern these things. But we think of them as being tools of efficiency and tools of productivity that will ebb and flow over time. And what won't change or shouldn't change is the desire to educate and inform our employees, educate and inform our customers, and then ask them to act responsibly. So for example, our responsible AI is built into our code of conduct because we think of it as being a natural part of what you should be doing as an employee. Now, for that to be true in the context of particularly generative AI, the only way that that can be true is by over-indexing on education, over-indexing on an ability to understand what these things are and aren't, so that you can then know how to act responsibly.
So if I can just get back, because I think there's a huge problem in the financial stability lens, in the sense that one of the things you're trying to solve for is the crisis that didn't happen. Right? Self-driving cars can kill you. They can also save you by preventing the accident that you never know would have happened because the person who didn't turn on the self-driving feature hit you. And we will never quantify that because it didn't happen. We will never know had Ned Gramlich succeeded at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in 2001 when he tried to promulgate the subprime mortgage regulation that was required in the 1994 law, and Alan Greenspan told him to shove it. We will never know if that regulation had stopped a crisis. What I know for certainty is any human being on earth who told you in 2001 through 2007 that you needed that regulation or else the subprime mortgage market was going to cause a global financial recession would have been laughed out of any respectable room. And so what I'm concerned about in these types of contexts is the job of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, right? And the job of the Office of Financial Research when we created it in Dodd-Frank was to be the Cassandra ringing the alarm bell when people weren't listening, becomes much more difficult in a context where you have an artificial intelligence, saying, ignore that, right? Or an artificial intelligence saying that, and it's much easier to discredit it because you don't know the crisis that was averted. You don't know any of these data points.
All right, so a range of views again. We have about 3 minutes, 4 minutes before I want to take questions. So, we talked about just now board and corporate governance. One suggestion that's been out there in the kind of public disclosure, let the buyer beware, is the idea of nutrition labels. There's something like the software bill of materials. The idea is, AI models that use data would come with some nutrition label that says, here's the data that's in it, here's how it's used, here's how it's cleaned. Anyone like that idea?
No.
Not really, no. Again, it doesn't make sense to me in the context of what problem are we trying to solve. Explaining to an end user that's attempting to interact with a chatbot that chatbot is fueled by some large language model that was created by OpenAI and that they use trillions of data points to be able to create it doesn't add value to the user experience.
I'll maybe go the opposite direction, but with a nuance. I think there's the element of who's going to use it and how it's going to be used, but maybe going down the path of what one of our panelists said yesterday, who's from AWS, around how they potentially look at publishing the AI that they have. They put it out there in terms of an audit and a lineage, and in terms of how they've done the job. Not because I think it's the way that then somebody will go in and say, well, let me look at that nutrition label and then utilize it in this way, but more because I think after the fact, it gives you a really good way to be able to trace potentially if something's gone wrong, how to look at it. So I don't think it's the nutrition label as much as it's the documentation that's critical.
I can tell you the number one feature used in the AI products that we have in the market is the citation feature. Because invariably, the model will provide you an answer and everyone wants to know where it came from or how it was sourced or how it was produced.
So to quote Michael Pollan, does anyone here think 100 calories of jelly beans is the same as 100 calories of raw broccoli? Right? Yeah? It's right. The whole nutrition label has sent us on this concept of fat, protein, carb, which has launched a very successful nutrition industry, but has it made us healthier? I mean, I struggle to find anybody in America who can find a single metric showing our national health has improved, right? In fact, many people would argue it's made us less healthy by focusing on the wrong key variables, using a 19th century definition of a first approximation of energy in an era of food shortage and famine being a much greater problem. Now, I think our biggest problem is too many calories of poor quality. Does anyone think Roaring Kitty should be a billionaire? Right? We have a situation where in financial markets, the ability, right, in nutrition, it takes a while to gain and lose weight, right? Not symmetrical, I might point out from my personal experience. In financial markets, things can move much, much faster. And when you start setting these these labels right, they may serve an important purpose at the time of introduction, but the over-reliance on these things can lead the entire market to recalibrate in a way that's deeply flawed, and that is a potential source of massive financial instability.
So this seems like a great point to turn over to the audience, a set of questions. I see some hands in the back. I guess we have some, and in the middle. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm really interested in the concept of LLMs and what they're calling cannibalism, I believe, which is in the sense that they're getting worse as the internet is more and more polluted with AI-generated content. So essentially collapsing in on itself as it's getting trained on AI-generated data. So I was just curious, because I don't know so much about synthetic data. As you're talking about synthetic data, are there those same risks that it can sort of collapse in on itself if it's sort of trained on itself effectively?
That was essentially what I was kind of pointing towards, which is if you don't have an ability to differentiate between synthetic data and real data, and then you proliferate synthetic data, then you've polluted the waters so much that you have an inability to use it to be able to distinguish why you would respond. You know, what the industry is really focused on now is things like small language models, by saying there's an expectation that large language models are going to start to become polluted in that sense. But if you use them for what they're intended, the pollution doesn't really matter, because it's not going to change the context of the way words interact with each other. There are more of them, and it's going to become reinforcing of the fact that there's some base level model that doesn't need to continue to be retrained. But your ability to understand intent is different. And so therefore, there's this growing push for small language models, which are models that specifically look at the interaction of words in a really particular context. And so in financial services, we imagine that that's going to start to grow. So again, we've very publicly talked about a joint development project we have with Google and DeepMind on the topic of structured finance. Because we say in the structured finance world, using the definition of words that comes from an LLM will drive you to the wrong outcome, because in structured finance, there is a very specific language of structured finance. And so it makes sense that if you're attempting to use these kinds of tools in that context, that you would do all of your pre-processing using, if you like, the known language and the known definition of that language, and then you would use an LLM to wrap it in a neat bow and make it consumable at the end.
Yeah, and I think again, going back to what I'd said earlier around using ChatGPT as an example for what AI is, in and of itself, what Nick talked about around small language models, for instance, specific to that side of it, is really what's emerging, right? And the idea essentially is that anything outside of the scope of that model, it doesn't answer. Right? If you ask it what the weather is or what the best way to plan a trip to Hawaii is, it's not going to answer. It's going to answer you structured finance questions. But also, going back to AI-ready data pipelines, The idea essentially is what you're giving that model is what it's trained on. So if you're actually governing the sources of which the data it's getting, it's not like it's this big giant Pac-Man that's going out and consuming data on its own. It's based on what you're giving it, and you also have the ability to turn on the auto learn and continuous learning features or turn it off. But one of the kind of key things around synthetic data that I do want to differentiate on is there's synthetic data which potentially help you solve for the flats of data or the noise in data or the spikes in data, which allow you to be able to potentially improve the quality of data, versus there is output of data AI, which is not synthetic data of sorts, because again, I think we need to classify what that is. In some cases, it could be real valid data. In some cases, not. But there is purposeful synthetic data that is used for synthetic purposes that could actually improve our use cases, versus there's stuff that's the output of AI, which I think has its own tagging, its own labeling as to not human generated but potentially useful, or not human generated and not very useful, which is an area we do have to look at in a little bit more detail.
Hi, I don't want to reignite the Uber conversation, but I did want to go back to that train of thought because, Aaron, your concern was that what we currently have for data is so bad that it's, not, it doesn't really matter, what we do with it. It's just we have to kind of reevaluate what we do with the data, and the solution to that was model testing that Anuj gave us. And I was just curious if you had a response to if that actually addresses your concerns, like testing different outputs at all.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because the easiest thing to do is to just be Mr. No, right? And it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. That's particularly easy in my seat at the Brookings Institution. When I had the privilege to serve in the Treasury Department, my boss, Secretary Geithner, one of his favorite lines was "plan beats no plan." And if you just went into the meeting and trashed everybody else's plan and had no alternative of your own, then you shouldn't come back to the next meeting, because we needed to do something. And so at the end of the day, I kind of have a more personal sympathy to marginal improvement. I wrote a piece on AI and credit rating decision-making, where I kind of argued if you're less discriminatory to FICO and more and more accurate, you should be allowed. Now, I'm not sure that's true legally. I'm not sure under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, right? The law does not ensconce FICO, which I view as the dominant AI in consumer finance. I've yet to really find a definition of AI that didn't include the FICO credit model. And it seems to have been grandfathered in, because if it were brand new and came out of the sky, I think it would fail any legitimate discriminatory test. And so in my view, I think if you're doing better than the status quo, I'm one of the people that would let all the cars go self-driving and be comfortable with the 75% auto fatality, understanding that thousands of people are going to die in self-driving car accidents. And we'll know every one of their names, and we will never know the tens of thousands of people that would have died in a different world. So if I had to be back in a policymaking position, I would use the status quo as my starting point, as my origin in the graph of improvement. But being in a think tank world, it's just much easier to point out all of the problems with all of the improvements, which is quite enjoyable at this moment.
So we have about 3 minutes for another question, and the third one I saw was Raul. I don't know if you still have one in the white shirt over there.
Thank you. First a comment and then a question. The comment is that one of the themes that I pick up on, certainly from what you said, Aaron, is that with the advent of data analytics and AI, we have a greater risk of humans making bigger mistakes, taking more risks. They have the ability, they have the permission, perhaps even the incentive to do that. So then the question becomes, what is the right level of education and training? And I'm not talking about the data scientists and all, I'm talking about senior leadership and the board of governors. How do you train them? How do you educate them to put on the right guardrails? And mind you, in that position, they know everything. They don't want to be taught things. So how do you train them? How do you educate them?
I think what we're seeing is we're seeing the governance structures around AI start to evolve, where it's not just how you deploy technology and the governance that used to be around that, but it's actually bringing in legal compliance, risk functions into it to be able to understand the actual outcome. Firms like Google, for instance, have had these bodies in place for a while when they evaluate their AI, they look at the ethical side of it, they look at the various other sides of it, and they try to understand it. And it's a board mandate that they do so such that they're not putting in certain things out there, if you will, that are harmful to the society. So we are actually seeing, I think, a shift in how those governance models are evolving. But to your point, the governance models evolving requires education, and I could not stress more. Like, to me, and I would probably say across the board of everything, education and how this actually works, and the distinction of what a model is up here versus what a model is over here, and what the technology is over there. Like, understanding some of that is actually completely available on YouTube. Right. In fact, a lot of people have changed their titles on LinkedIn to Chief AI Officer primarily because they went to YouTube to go check it out. It's all there. It's all there to start with, and nobody needs to know you were watching the video. But in my opinion, like, at the end of the day, like, start educating yourself, start kind of propagating education out. There's all kinds of resources. I think it's absolutely critical. But to one other point that you made around, how to get the education to the type of person that knows everything. A data scientist needs to understand, statistical stuff. And quite honestly, I read Aaron's paper last night. I couldn't make sense of it, right? But prompt engineering is not that difficult. It's a completely different skill set. There's other skill sets in this world of machine learning around data engineering, et cetera, that are not the same as this. So let's not focus in on that one skill set. Let's focus in on that ecosystem of personas that need to be available, and get some of those other skills out there as well.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes, and I get the last question. Sorry for those left in the audience with questions. Since the theme of this conference is AI and financial stability, I really want to zone in on one source of systemic risk that Aaron's talked a lot about, the 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis, and it's the externality that occurs when individual entities, commercial or not, jump on the bandwagon of a new technology or a new fancy financial thing, but here we're talking the new technology, to gain a competitive edge, and others who didn't jump on the bandwagon jump on it just to not fall behind. And with a new technology, it can be very hard to assess the risk, even to the entity. And so as they're taking on this risk, the risk to the financial system as a whole, because of the interconnectedness of the individual entities, grows bigger and faster than the sum of the risk to the parts. So you've got an audience here of a lot of policymakers and regulators, not just in the room, but watching online, and who will get to watch when this is on the website forever after. So what advice do you have for them? How would you recommend that they best mitigate this risk?
I mentioned this a little earlier. Think about Moody's business model is about driving transparency and an ability to access markets. That's what a credit rating is. It's to give people a fair shot at being able to understand something that they might not have been able to process themselves. And so we like the idea of more participation. We like the idea of transparency. We like the idea of having a market that's open with equal access to information. However, these tools are going to allow participants into this market, which we like, into a regulatory environment that wasn't necessarily designed to handle less sophisticated participants. That's, I guess, the way that I would describe it. So if you think all of the rules and regulations, all of the governance is structured around the idea that there are some boundaries to this market, there is some assumed knowledge to accessing this market. And so in my mind, we need to revisit those rules, because we're opening the door to having less sophisticated participants in a market, because they don't need to know the language of that market, because they can now use their own language to interact with it. And so therefore, we need a way of being able to make sure that they're protected, because I don't know that we can exclude them anymore, and that there's a regulatory environment to be able to handle what happens when you democratize access to these kinds of markets. Again, I would say on the one side, we like the idea of democratization of access to these markets, but we're nervous about whether we've got a regulatory environment to be able to handle it.
Yesterday, we heard from various speakers about the concept of monitoring. My question was, monitor what? Right, and there's so much to monitor. So when we start to kind of think about what we need feedback from, what do we need signal from, There's systemic, right? Then underneath that, there's sector. We talked about the different regulated, non-regulated sector. Underneath that, there's firms, systemically important firms, but also other broader firms that maybe weren't regulated and need to be more regulated based on some of the proposals out there, or were thought to need to be more regulated. Within those firms are the lines of business that do different things, right? So a large bank might have multiple things that they do, or a healthcare company might have multiple things that they do. Within those lines of business are the use cases, the specific place where the AI is being applied. That's being built on a platform, a technology platform, like from the cloud providers, from the various models that are out there. And part of that then is the third party. So what do you need signals from, right? You need different signals from each of those different layers, right? In order to be able to understand systemic risk, in order to be able to understand the firm risk, and in order to be able to understand the platform risk, there's not this uniform kind of monitoring exercise that can get you there. And it's also not a point in time versus, if you will, once a year. So being able to kind of have clarity around that framework. And quite honestly, also in terms of what we do every day, having a clarity and guidance back to us as to what signals do we need to put into those different layers such that they can properly be monitored. And it's not something that we're doing retroactively and going back and spending a lot of money doing, and probably not doing that well, is going to be absolutely critical. So I think from a standpoint of financial stability, but also the audience that we're speaking to, what signals should you look for at those different layers, and how could we get guidance around building those signals in such that you have the ability to monitor, I think is an absolutely critical way to go forward.
So building on some of the themes that we had yesterday, I would encourage regulators to embrace the technology. I would encourage them to play around with it. I would encourage them to dedicate resources to seeing what it has to offer, and not just trying to regulate it, but try to use it. I think you will actually become a better regulator if you try to incorporate it into your own business model. I think there's kind of a Rousseau nature of it all. I'm also constantly concerned about age. AI and technology is so much more intuitive the younger you get. Senior regulators, by definition, tend to be on the older age of the spectrum, and that discordant. I think there's a lot of wisdom that comes from having gone through cycles of hype. AI can be a tool to mitigate systemic risk, both within the financial system and by its use within the financial regulatory system. It could also be the source of systemic risk because, as I said earlier, it's the crises are the fundamental mispricing of an asset and leverage. I don't know what the value of an AI model is. Neither does the market. Some market companies that are deep in AI have seen tremendous explosions. None of us could have known the difference between Netscape and Google, or if you did, hopefully, you're going to endow a chair at Brookings with that outcome of that wisdom, because at the end of the day, right, these things are very difficult to know. But I think if the regulators can use the technology, the last point I would make is it's okay to disagree, even amongst yourselves. Right? It's a council. The council should not be unanimous on a tough, difficult question. And so fostering a culture within your regulatory body where people who disagree are respected for that disagreement rather than trying to achieve an internal consensus. Because the one thing I know is if there are 10 different opinions in the room, it's more likely that one of those 10 are right than if there's one opinion shared by 10 people.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. We are a little over time, but thank you to the audience for your good questions. And maybe, as Nick suggested, 3 years from now, we'll come back and ask him again. And with this, I think we're taking a 10-minute break.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are the two mics turned off? Oh, here, sorry. These are all turned on.
Oh, great.
Excellent. They were all turned on.
Yes.
Oh, you do need them on. Oh, I'm sorry.
Unmute them. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Okay. That reminds me of when I left that little
In which
credit.
in Virginia?
Remember that little card I? By the way, they ended that
Name sounds
sponsorship.
familiar.
I was at a show at.
Yeah. All right. That's. I certainly knew Jackie.
All right, you'll pull them in from in there.
But yeah, thank you for.
Anyway, I wanted to say hello.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Before I have a hot mic moment, if folks could please start coming back in and sit down, and folks from online, you can start to unmute and get ready. If everybody could take their seats. Commissioner, do you have a number, like how many commissioners there have been? Or no?
How many there are?
No. I'd like the 46th president of the United States or the 7th commissioner of 17th.
Of Virginia?
Yeah.
14th.
You're the 14th.
Yeah. Going back to 1905.
Wow.
It's not bad, right?
That's pretty
Since I've been here, some states have had 4 or 5 in one state. I'm not kidding.
No, I believe it.
Yeah.
If everybody could sit down, and we're going to get started. It's a great honor and privilege to have a keynote with Commissioner White, who is the 14th Commissioner of Insurance in the Commonwealth of Virginia. One thing that those of us who live in financial services understand is the business of insurance is a necessary but not sufficient part of the entire financial system. That is, the financial system doesn't work if insurance doesn't work. Our lives don't work if insurance doesn't work. Our houses, our ability to operate our vehicles, and our ability to live our lives requires the business of insurance to be underwritten and to be properly offered and regulated. And America, unique among all major economies that I'm aware of in the world, has insurance regulated at the state level. And this system has worked, actually surprisingly well. As Commissioner White pointed out, he's the 14th commissioner for the Commonwealth of Virginia who's been at this for well over 100 years. And all of us have this. And in many ways, insurance is at the forefront of artificial intelligence being incorporated into the financial services. Witness the prior conversation talking about autonomous vehicles. All of our vehicles are insured. Or looking at model risk of natural catastrophes and homeowners policies insurance, which I hope everyone in this room has either homeowners or renters insurance. And Commissioner White, why don't we start by understanding how you and the Commonwealth of Virginia have looked at incorporating artificial intelligence into both the business of insurance and the job of regulating the business of insurance?
Happy to, Aaron. And first, let me thank you for the invitation. As you pointed out, here in D.C., insurance is sometimes overlooked or not as much as a conversation as we would like to be in issues where we know there's overlap with other financial services industries. So it's very much appreciated to be here and talk about interests that align, I know, with again, the other financial sectors. We are the state-based system, which we have to explain, when we go on the international stage, right, which differs quite fundamentally from how insurance is regulated, say, in Europe and then, of course, in D.C. But we have been very much appreciative of the enhanced dialogue we've been having through conversations like this and other venues, and so I'm happy to continue that today. So I'll start by pointing out that, yes, I'm the Commissioner of Virginia. And so I have an agency that oversees our market in Virginia, the Commonwealth, as he so rightly pointed out. But I also need to mention that because we regulate 56 jurisdictions, the 50 states and the 6 territories, including D.C., we obviously need a more collaborative nationwide system to help establish standards and model laws, regulations, things of that nature, and get expertise from a variety of sources. So for that, we have what's called the NAIC. the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and they've really driven the work in this space over the last 4 years. And so, it might be useful to start out there because the states, including Virginia, have kind of leveraged off the work done there to take what's been done back to our own departments, right? Where we try to find out in Virginia, what are we seeing with the companies we regulate, whether they're domestic companies that are domiciled in Virginia or coming from out of state, an Allstate or a State Farm, for example. And I would kind of describe it as a journey over the last 4 years, and in terms of trying to monitor what the industry is doing and trying to make sure that we have a strong regulatory framework in place to make sure that the use of AI systems by these companies is done fairly and ethically, and the use of the data is accurate, things of this nature. So we started out, with, like a lot of jurisdictions, at the bottom developing principles, right? And this occurred in 2020, and these principles were based around fairness and ethical treatment use, accountability, compliance with laws, transparency, and then having a safe, secure, and robust environment that consumers can have confidence in, that the companies are using these appropriately. So these are not something we developed out of whole cloth. They were a combination from different jurisdictions, and there's a lot of overlap with other principles that you will see. But we took those, and the next step in that was to develop the framework. And that's what we spent the next 2 years doing, and we just adopted that back in December. It's what we call our AI bulletin. When I say bulletin, that means it's not a model law, it's not a model regulation. It is basically guidance to the industry. It is our expectations as regulators as to, if you're using an AI system, if you're using it in any way that impacts consumers across the life cycle of the product. And that could be marketing, it could be rating, underwriting, claims handling, loss prevention, fraud detection. Think of the multiple varied uses, as you pointed out rightly. There's a lot of different benefits and opportunities for the industry to use these things, and certainly we don't want to discourage that. We don't want to discourage innovative use, but we want to make sure that the industry has proper controls in place to mitigate the risks that I heard in the prior panel that are well recognized. And so this is again expectations to the industry based on existing law. We think we have broad laws such as our Unfair Trade Practices, our Unfair Settlement Practices Act, a whole host of acts that say when it comes to this particular risk, this is how we intend to apply these laws to the use of AI systems, right? And the other thing we say in this document, in this bulletin is, and this is the information we expect you to provide us when we come in and talk to the company about how it's being used. This is the documentation we're going to expect you to be able to provide us for us to do our evaluation. And I'll make a couple of points. When we went into this, we decided we wanted it to be not prescriptive, right? We didn't feel like it made sense, and I think you're seeing this with a lot of other jurisdictions, to put specific requirements in place to test the outcomes and decisions of these companies, because there's a couple of reasons for that. It's a very fast-moving environment, right? So you put these laws in place, it's very difficult to go back and change those as needed. It's how we handle a lot of other risks, like cybersecurity risk. It's basically risk-focused. We are focused on risk management and corporate governance, and how are the companies using those concepts as they have to do with other risks to address the use of AI systems. And the other thing I would mention is the proportionality of this, right? So we regulate companies that operate on the global stage, all the way down to what we call our county mutual. So there has to be proportionality in terms of how these are applied, and that's built into the flexibility of this document. And also, how are they using it, right? We're focused on consumer harm, right? When you're developing your AI systems and the controls around that, you need to be focused more, at least for our purposes as regulators, on what's the potential risks or harms to consumers, rather than maybe some of the back-end processes that don't concern us quite as much, except for the areas of cybersecurity.
So you mentioned that this December NAIC bulletin, when you went to go apply its principles and apply the granularity of the bulletin in the Commonwealth, you felt that you had a legal structure and framework that was sufficient,
Right, and I will qualify that by saying, as with everything else, this bulletin was adopted at the NAIC by our executive plenary. That's the structure that approves model laws, model regs, and other things, including this bulletin. The next step in that is to take it back to the states. And so we're at the adoption phase of that, and Virginia has not quite yet adopted it. We're at the tail end of reviewing it. We're adapting it to our own specific laws and tweaking it as other states have done. I think to this point, there's around 16 states that have either adopted the bulletin or some version that they already had in place. So you're around 16, but I expect that as we go along this year, that those numbers are going to increase substantially.
Excellent. Let me turn to an element within that has always bedeviled me. You talked about fairness and discriminatory things, and it's always struck me that society is schizophrenic on what we consider discriminatory. There's basically in insurance and other parts of finance, we make a lot of distinctions, but it's really risk-based pricing. Risk-based pricing just comes up over and over and over again. And we say, on the one hand, society, we want to price you according to risk. On the other hand, there are these elements about you which are unfair to you. So in health insurance, right, your genome tells you a lot about health risks, but your DNA is not going to be an acceptable underwriting criteria for your health insurance. As it relates to the provision of credit, we do not allow gender. Even though women are better credit risks, I would like to thank all the women in the world for giving me a lower interest rate than I otherwise deserve. When it relates to car insurance, gender is one of the first things used. When my daughter turns 16 and starts driving in Maryland, I'm going to pay less than my neighbor across the street for his son, solely on the basis of our gender. So in one financial service, we allow gender. In another, we don't. In insurance, there are other things that are not allowed that are different than banking. How in the unique world of insurance, where states, by the way, have different discriminatory laws across all 50 as opposed to a national framework in banking, although there are some state variations in banking too. How do you think about that, and how do you think about enforcing the anti-discriminatory world within artificial intelligence, within the business of insurance, which is very different definitions of protected class, through business lines within insurance, as well as between the states?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think you need to break it out into two separate concepts. What you're talking about is this notion of protected classes, right? So in certain lines of insurance, life insurance has very clear prohibitions on rating or underwriting based on, whatever it might be, race, for example, right, that we all know about. And I would say there's a lot of uniformity around what these protected classes are. This gets back to the idea of we have model laws that are passed at the NAIC level and have gone back to the states. So I would suggest there's a lot of uniformity. Where it gets to be more challenging and where the AI comes in is this idea of proxy discrimination, right? Or when you get to the AI, we call it algorithmic bias. Now, you have to remember bias in insurance, and this is why it's so critical to separate out insurance from the other financial services. Bias is a part of insurance. Bias is not, nobody would argue bias is a bad thing if you explain it properly, right? So what are we talking about with risk-based pricing that creates this bias, which is you're using risk factors with this to provide the same coverage with a policyholder that results in different pricing, right? So the example I always give is you wouldn't be able to use somebody who has green eyes, so we're going to charge you a different rate. That's not actuarially sound in terms of saying this factor requires different pricing. Then it gets into the more challenging ones. Credit is one we've struggled with for decades, and the issue around credit is what you're talking about. Is it's not discriminatory against particular protected class such as race, but it could be a proxy factor, right? We can see a correlation between the use of somebody's credit score and their propensity to get involved in an accident, right? And so, but when you look further into that, there could be other correlations with certain disadvantaged classes that could have a negative impact around that. Again, that gets back to, this is a policy decision. And so to that point, when it comes to credit, you're right, different states have taken different approaches. And so that, but then it gets to, well, where does AI come in? And gets back to these, you have these huge data sets, you have these algorithmic models that can now process this, so it can amplify potential biases. This is really what it comes down to when you're talking about AI. This has always been an issue. It's now been amplified. This is really the case with AI. It takes existing problems and amplifies them, given the power computing it now has around that, which has required us to deal with it in different ways. The one we always talk about are what we call predictive rate models, and these are used to develop pricing rates around primarily P&C products, homeowners and auto. And when we go in there, we want to make sure that the data, they're using historical data sets, again, which could perpetuate bias that we want to not allow in Virginia, because that gets to our existing Unfair Claims Settlement or Unfair Trade Practices Act. So I hope that answers your question. So you have the very basic idea around insurance. You can it's risk-based pricing. We do have, protected classes that you can't use those with, but within that, we also have, we look at proxies where there may be correlation with risk, but we're still not going to allow that if we can demonstrate that it may impact these protected classes.
In the prior panel, somebody talked about one of the benefits of like a good AI, not pointing out like measuring your eyes on the road.
Right.
And then that would be a feedback loop. And then I was reminded by some news reports I'd read that showed that the definition from the computer about eyes on the road had a racial skew based on the size of people's eyes, on the correlation of race and gender of eyes. And so you were creating a data set based on a model that sounded like a reasonable factor, but when you actually put the technology in practice, it had these very different racial and gender outcomes where the data is then seeming to indicate one group of people are paying more attention than another. And I mean, I have a bad driver on my policy, and when my rate went up because of a lot of bad driving, I asked him to look at my FICO, and all of a sudden my rate went back down.
Right. And that's the thing. I mean, risk-based pricing at its core is going to benefit many policyholders who have favorable risk characteristics. So, and that's what allows insurance to, this idea around risk pooling is you have the good drivers with the bad drivers, and it averages out where the company can earn a profit and folks have affordable and available insurance.
Yeah. Well, speaking about insurance, you raised in the beginning the Washington versus states thing, which is a real big issue, and I really commend FSOC for leaning in and incorporating the state perspective, both as a non-voting member, having a representative on the board, but also as part of this very conversation. Yesterday, Secretary Yellen made some news, and she said the Federal Insurance Office is going to hold a roundtable on AI. What do you want to see come out of that?
Well, I had not heard that, but on one level, it doesn't surprise me. I do think, some of these issues we're grappling with right now in insurance reflect broader concerns that are in the capital markets, in our economy, and in society more broadly. Think about climate risk, you think about cybersecurity, and you think about AI. These are top of mind for insurance regulators, given the role of the insurance sector. And of course, FIO has a role to play in terms of their collection of data and understanding the issues, and we've seen that with climate more recently. I know I think they had a roundtable on cybersecurity, and so for them to want to bring stakeholders and perhaps state regulators together to have these discussions, again, that doesn't surprise me too much. What I will say is to further that point is that when you go to the international stage, right, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, where we work with FIO and the Federal Reserve are part of what we call Team USA. This is one of these issues that are top of mind with them as well. They issue what we call a global insurance report every year, and they focus on special topics. What topics are they focused on? Cybersecurity, climate risk, AI, everything we're working on back home, financial stability being another one. So I think it's always important to have that dialogue. One thing I will say in terms of addressing some of these risks, we have to have collaboration with all the stakeholders. So for us, it's been getting our arms around what is the industry, how are they using this, right? So while we were drafting this bulletin, we were also going out and surveying, a very extensive survey with each of the lines, homeowners, life insurance, health insurance, auto, and seeing how who's using it and how. right? Again, across the life cycle of that product. Here's what we found more or less generally. I'll make some general observations. Very high percentage on auto, for example, are using it in some way, right? But how are they using it? They're not using it so much with the big concerns I just mentioned, the predictive rate models that could really amplify bias and create proxy discrimination or whatever we might be concerned about. It is being used, and we are looking at that, but it's really being used with claims handling. It's being used with marketing, where you can find these more easy to identify use cases. So it's being used more broadly, but they are, again, I would call it, we're kind of at our inception, which is why I think it's so timely to get this bulletin out right now and get these expectations set. They are trying to find use cases. And I want to go back to the question you asked before, is this bulletin that we issued is guidance to the industry. But it's all, and so it should send a strong signal. We're going to be looking at this very carefully, and we're going to be asking very tough questions. But we are also using it as an internal document. So how are we putting in place a regulatory framework to make sure we're going in there on the market conduct examination side, on the financial examination side, and asking the right questions? Do you view this as a material risk? You have to file this own risk assessment with the states, your domestic regulator, every year. And is this a material risk? If so, how are you using it? And how are you putting in controls to mitigate that? So again, I use this as a blueprint. Once we get it adopted in Virginia, we're going to be sitting down and training our staff as to how to do this, which gets to another point. States are resource strapped, right? We have folks retiring. And somebody in the last panel mentioned we need folks who have different skill sets than somebody like me who has struggles turning on his computer. We are very consciously hiring folks, young folks, the digital natives. We need these folks in here to help us implement this bulletin. We created a new division in my agency last year, or the State Corporation Commission's Bureau of Insurance, that is focused exclusively on data analysis and cybersecurity and strategic planning, again, to be able to really be proactively adapting to the rapid changes we're seeing, particularly in this area.
Well, we have time for a couple questions from the audience. I wanted to pause and see if anybody here has a question for Commissioner White in this space. No, that's going to let me then come back to kind of something you raised about Team USA. And my experience in financial services in the Basel banking context was the regulators all said that they sat together. The plethora of American regulators said that they cooperated with each other internationally. And then they came back to Washington and all trashed each other behind closed doors to members of Congress, saying each one is, this one's a Luddite, this one's being risky, this one, this, that. And within this context where you have the states being the implementers, you have the association, right, which has tremendous, every association I've ever seen has tremendous divergence in that space. And then you have the federal position. How have you seen that working on the global stage? Because AI is coming everywhere. We're going to be unique because we're America, right? We're still dealing in miles when the rest of the world's in kilometers. But on the other hand, these same threats are going to be everywhere. Yeah. How have you seen that working out in practice?
Well, when it comes to AI, we haven't had too many specific discussions. Over the last year or so, where we've had the discussions and tried to work with particularly FIO on what our respective roles are and how do we work collaboratively, or in climate risk and financial stability. And also on the international stage, we are fully aligned in developing a group capital standard that works for our U.S. markets, and that differs from what Europe is going to implement. So we've been aligned in making our arguments for why what we call our aggregation method is what we're going to be using for our U.S. markets. With climate, you may have read that there was a data call that FIO initially put out, and the states, shortly after that, it was already in the works, developed our own data call that was more robust. But at the end of the day, instead of having two data sets go out to the industry, we did collaborate and we did work with FIO. And so where it stands today is the states as the regulators and the ones that have the capabilities to collect what is the largest data collection in the history of the U.S. insurance markets will be collecting that data and will be providing a subset of that data to file for their own analysis purposes.
So in Washington, we're constantly concerned, particularly among the more liberal inclined of us, with the argument of regulatory arbitrage.
Right.
That with this plethora of regulators, people are always trying to sense and go towards the weakest regulatory. You just made a different argument, which is regulatory competition, where you guys were kind of one-upping each other and then coordinating.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it competition. We would acknowledge that FIO has an interest in climate risk in terms of what that federal agency is intended to look at. We always make the point, and I think FIO understands this. We're the supervisors, we're the regulators of the industry. So, we think they need to be careful in issuing data calls if it's something that we've collected or can do. But certainly having these discussions around cyber and AI, particularly to the extent they involve us, I think can be helpful.
So let me close then with this one thing. You are the supervisor. You are dealing with insurance companies, insuring a plethora of risks. I view Virginia as so risky, I try not to go there. Now, that's my Maryland bias talking, right? What have you seen on the ground with artificial intelligence in insurance that you think is the potential best situation to come out going forward, and the thing that kind of keeps you up at night a little bit?
Well, I think that's a great way to frame it, right? Because you look at AI, you look at all the challenges, be able to harness these benefits while mitigating the risks. It's just we're going to see these companies develop different use cases around that. We do think it's going to lead to more efficient operations. We think it will develop more accurate pricing, right? And so that's good for most people who have better risk characteristics. Where you can see questions arise, and this is more of a hypothetical at this point, is what if they get really good at pricing? And this sometimes the term is used as micro pricing, right? And then it kind of raises questions about the viability of risk pools that underpins the total concept of insurance. And that then becomes, I think, an issue for the policymakers to address. I don't know if that will ever occur. I'm starting to get more questions about that, and you can kind of see if it goes down to its, you follow that to its logical conclusion where that might happen. But I do know that the companies, I can tell you the companies have been engaged as we develop this bulletin. I believe that they want to use these systems fairly and ethically. And I do think, again, with this bulletin, we're sending a signal that we expect you to do that. And this is how we're going to ensure that you have the processes and the systems in place that occurs. So, again, I think we're all on the same page in terms of wanting to encourage innovative and beneficial practices that benefit consumers while making sure those harms are mitigated, if not eliminated.
Are you saying the logical conclusion of micropricing, the AI can figure out that out of millions of people, there's somebody that is such a bad driver that their actuarial rate of car insurance may preclude them based on their income, because if we're going to assume income and driving skill have some non-correlation, that they're just, right? I mean, they're just too bad a driver to insure?
Well, this gets to an issue that is a theme of the NEIC this year, protection gaps, right? And you can see this in climate pretty easily. But if you do have these sophisticated algorithms with the data sets being used and you scale that, and 5 years, 10 years down the road, it does, the micropricing you can assume is going to become more precise. And people have different opinions about what that leads to. But it's just something that, again, it's things, these are questions that get asked sometimes, and it's something that we're, at least looking at.
Well, listen, that's gonna give me a lot to think about over this weekend, and you've given the audience in this entire conference a lot to think about. Please join me in thanking the Commissioner.
All right, thank you.
And we're going to introduce the next panel. And it gives me a tremendous honor to introduce John Fort, who will moderate the panel. If you are not watching John, you are not watching. John is a preeminent journalist in the intersection of technology and finance, from his perch at CNBC to his roots reporting in Silicon Valley. John, thank you very much for joining us here at Brookings.
Thanks for having me. Let's see. What order am I introducing you guys in? Looks like we got Nicole, and then we've got Keith, and then we've got Joanne. Okay. First of all, let me thank my high school classmate and friend, Aaron Klein. We were in student government together at Montgomery Blair. We're celebrating 30 years next month. Believe it or not, we take ourselves much less seriously now than we did then. So that is saying something. But I'm excited to get this panel started, so let me call out the panelists in order, hopefully, of how they're sitting. I think I got this right. Nicole Turner-Lee is Senior Fellow, Government Studies, and Director of the Center for Technology and Innovation here at Brookings, an ace on public policy and access to technology. And then we've got Keith Toney, EVP and President, Credit and Decision Management at Discover. You know, Discover Bank, Diners Club, third largest credit card brand out there. And Joanne Barefoot, founder and CEO of the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, former senior bank regulator, Capitol Hill staffer, bringing tech and finance together, hopefully to make the system more fair. I get that right?
Absolutely. Perfect.
I like to get it right. I'm John Ford. I talk to smart people on TV about tech and finance. I actually want to start off in a weird place with Roaring Kitty, not because it has anything to do with AI, but because I do think it has something to do with when technology and the users of it get ahead of the rules and regulations that we're used to, because people are looking at this guy with a headband on and a Twitter account moving a stock around like crazy. And apparently the rules say that's not stock manipulation, maybe, because he doesn't seem to be lying and he doesn't seem to be shilling for a company without telling people. He doesn't seem to be shilling for anybody but himself. So just starting there, Nicole, are we potentially at a point already where we're not ready with rules to govern AI?
Ooh, that's a big question, and this is a short period of time to answer it.
That's what I specialize in, both those things.
So I think, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, Aaron got the right person. And I'm a talker too, so just stop me.
I will.
So I think this is a really interesting question, right? Because one of the things that I think researchers are starting to do with the word artificial intelligence is really begin to unpack it as a process of autonomous decision-making, right, and activity. And what you're suggesting is, you know, not only are there no rules, but there's also this ecosystem that's sort of evolving. I do a lot of broadband work, for example, which does not really apply to some of the traditional standards and practices that we're familiar with. I just finished up a report for the Commodities Future Trading Commission, which was the first report as part of the Technology Advisory Committee chartered by Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, and we wrote about AI in financial markets. And you'd be surprised by the fact that there are really no guardrails that are in that space at this moment. So to your point about how do we look at trading and derivatives, how do we look at these tools that are sort of autonomously acting out in ways that are not necessarily breaking the law and could be sort of guided under, you know, other stipulations. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's trying to increase the public value of what people do and know about the space. It's really problematic.
Do we even know when organizations are using AI?
We don't. That's the problem.
Okay. Should we, Joanne, should we know?
Probably. The nature of this is that we have, as was said in the previous panel, we have principles that are going to stay probably pretty much unchanged, and that regulators and others can apply to these challenges. But we don't have enough rules, and we also are not going to be able to adopt rules that we're going to get right the first time and are going to work forever. This is a technology like fire or electricity or something. You know, it's going to permeate everything. It's going to flow through the system in ways that are unexpected, causing problems that we don't know about. And how we gear up to keep up with it without chilling the good things, and do that in a way that can remain agile doesn't come naturally. As you noted, I'm a former bank regulator and Capitol Hill staffer. It doesn't come naturally to keep on trying to change what we're doing, but we're going to have to develop mechanisms to do that.
Keith, we talk about the black box problem with AI, the idea of we don't know why it's decided what it's decided. I think arguably for a lot of consumers, that's already a problem with the system we have today. They don't understand why either they got the interest rate that they got or they can't get the credit card that they want, et cetera. So, are you guys using what we today call AI yet, and how are you explaining how it works?
We certainly use AI. It's been mentioned, I think, multiple times over the 2 days that a lot of the participants have been using AI for quite some time. But I think there is a lack of common understanding around what AI means. And there's AI as a broad topic, right, which is technology that can mimic kind of human interactions. But inside of that, the concept of machine learning, which is a much more structured and deliberate part of the AI, where we can build what we refer to as supervised models that allow us to make decisions around credit and credit cards and so forth in such a ways that they can be more deliberate and understood, and then we can explain them, right? So those models have explainability capabilities. And in our business, we have a construct that we work with our regulators that have oversight functions. They review those models and so forth. And so we can kind of execute according to that framework. The more, as you get deeper into AI, the generative AI models, those are unsupervised models, right? They're essentially unleashed on all of that text, and then they can produce a response. And I think to the heart of maybe your question, those responses are assumed to be knowledge, right? And I think the prior panelists talked about the difference between these are text generator kind of tools versus knowledge generator tools. So the explainability is pretty different construct in the generative AI sense versus what we do in kind of the core of some of our banking applications.
A couple things I want to do. First, I want to take a step back and ask you guys about the impact of the PC, the web, and mobile, right, on the financial system and how ready we were for those things, and if we're done dealing with the consequences. Then I want to let you guys know, I actually want to open it up for questions a couple times sooner than the very end, because sometimes you want to talk about something that we talked about like 15 minutes in, and then we're 40 minutes in, and it feels kind of stale. Don't want that to happen. So be ready for that soon. But starting with PC and the web, it's almost weird to try to think about it, Quicken and stuff like that. What was the finance experience, the personal finance experience like, the stock purchase, retail investor experience like before the PC? And what are the advantages and dangers that we've gotten, Nicole, since then?
So this is a great time for me to do a shameless plug on my forthcoming book, August 6th.
Best kind of plug.
At the Brookings bookstore and published by Brookings Press. So I have a book coming out. It's entitled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. And I actually talk about this shift from analog to digital systems and the extent to which financial inclusion has really been a part of this advancement of the web, right? When we first started in very analog systems, no one was taking a picture of their checks and, sending it via phone because we didn't have mobile, right? And we had a regulatory environment that at least created the conditions for us to actually blow up the mobile ecosystem, where we're able to do things that are very much running off of our networks in ways that we've never imagined. But to your point, we have seen, I guess, a good news story where there has been financial inclusion. One of the things I talk about in the book, for example, when it comes to things like Cash App, we would have never had things like that without the internet. And so I think that, there's a good news story in how technology has been able to evolve. evolve to include more people. Now, as a person who studies, the intersection between technology, social justice, and race, there are problems, right? Because technically these are transactional uses of the mobile web, which do not necessarily lend themselves to people being banked. So to your point, in many respects, as we've seen the internet evolve, we have emboldened these new technologies that give more agency to consumers. But it does also suggest, and I love that Aaron invited me to this panel, that there needs to be collateral, right? There has to be not just the collateral of a bank account, but now you need the collateral of something that is internet-based to be able to participate. And that's something, as we have this conversation today, it's really hard to talk about artificial intelligence without talking about closing the digital divide. Because in essence, you're creating, again, I think some areas where this conversation is more complicated because the people who didn't benefit from the evolution of the web, to where we are today, will probably still fall behind when we talk about financial services and products.
Yeah, to that point, Joanne, I am a fiend when it comes to looking at the interest rate on savings accounts. I'm like, look what happened. How come I'm moving all my money tomorrow to this other account? But a lot of users, right, who aren't watching rates day by day and maybe who aren't they're not doing that. And that divide, the impact of it kind of stacks, doesn't it?
They need to get their robot to do it. I'm serious, actually. I mean, if there is an affordable business model, there is potential that this problem of the consumer of financial services or the investor not being attentive or not being highly financially literate or not being sophisticated or being too busy, all of it, that the AI agent may be part of the solution to that and may start to level the playing field a little bit between the provider and the consumer, which is sort of the core problem we have in financial services, that it's a very asymmetrical marketplace almost all the time. Could I also just comment on your previous question?
Sure.
Quickly? I completely agree with your point, Nicole, but at the same time, if we step back, the mobile phone, I think, is the most democratizing invention in the history of finance. It has created a channel that people already have all over the world. We're doing work in West Africa, for example, and the ability to deliver financial services through that phone instead of having to build a bank branch, it's brought more people into access than we could have imagined.
Yeah,
but I want to go to Keith here on this, but it's broccoli, right? Like the interest rate on savings, people would rather chase GameStop or buy Bitcoin or get on DraftKings, right? Like those are the things that are potentially going to distract that underbanked user.
Yeah.
And there's much more of an incentive than, hey, the rate on your Discover bank account is actually going to be a little bit better than the one that you're getting, right?
Yeah, I think of a couple of the comments that were made, and certainly there's a tremendous amount of distraction, the DraftKings example and so forth, and then also just maybe the financial fundamentals and understanding. I mean, one of the things at Discover we're super proud about is we have 100% US-based customer service, and we make it very, very easy for a customer, even if they're on the mobile or they're on the web, to be able to call, and within 60 seconds, you're talking to someone who can help you answer questions. And so
an actual human
being. An actual human being.
Sounds expensive.
And actually, but the return on that with the customers that we retain makes that economics works. We're super excited to augment them with some of the co-pilot tools and so forth, but the fundamental belief at the moment is that human in the loop will stay, and that conversation will be there to educate those customers that want to talk.
Yeah, and I want to respond also. I think you're completely right, Jordan? Like what we've seen globally, and I talk about that in the book, what we've seen in Africa, what we've seen in other countries has been amazing. We still had a problem doing that in the United States, right? Because of financial incumbents and the way in which we structure our financial services. So I do think we've seen a democratized environment when it comes to mobile and technology and the way it's advanced into AI. But we also have to be careful, and I love what you're talking about in terms of the human experience, right? Where we get it wrong, and this is the work we do at Brookings when it comes to AI equity, is the human, being taken out of the loop. Now, I did hear a really interesting professor tell me this, that when humans are in charge, though, in financial services, maybe we're actually defeating the purpose, too. because maybe they should be, overcharged or not necessarily be in the middle of an autonomous decision for the reasons that you're talking about. And so I think that there's still just a lot of discussion that has to be had on how you balance that innovation with what real, the real scenario of what wealth creation and access to assets looks like, in our context.
Yeah, going back to the self-driving example that Aaron brought up that was popular this morning, I mean, maybe people helped create the discriminatory outcomes that we've seen up to this point, and maybe AI will be a bit better at it, but who knows? I want to talk about the dangers and the opportunities here from the use of AI, and that's sort of how we'll break down, hopefully, the question periods. So, Joanne, starting with the dangers, it seems like a couple of them are, A, that AI is unfair, and then B, that bad guys use it better than good guys, right? The attacks on the system are more AI-fueled and better incentivized than the benefits or the defense. How does the balance of dangers look to you right now?
I think that there's no doubt about the dangers being mind-boggling. I mean, I just think that, and I'm a technophile, I'm a tech optimist, but really bad things could happen. I think we're going to need to be preparing for cyber attacks beyond anything we've imagined before. I think individuals are going to be subject to very sophisticated fraud and scam type attacks. It's already happening. Fraud is skyrocketing already, and we've only begun to see it all. And I will say, similarly to what I said before, I think we're going to actually need AI to defend against AI. So it's going to continue to be an arms race, but we better make sure the good guys are really being equipped. I also do think, though, that the upside opportunity is enormous if we get it right, and we may not. But back to the point I made before, if people had the ability to have more information, like what if they could see through pricing that included hidden fees and junk fees, to name something that the CFPB is very concerned about. It's not easy to do that if it's well hidden. But if you had a sophisticated enough tool, you could do it. Or what if you wanted to protect your privacy, your data, and you can't really understand how it's being used? Those kinds of things could be done. And then if the regulatory system required a tool like that to be optimized for the best interest of the consumer, not any secondary agenda, which there's similar things out there now that do have a second, business model under them, then we might be able to work on regulating that, and maybe not, as I say this as a veteran of consumer protection regulation for decades and decades. Maybe we wouldn't have to spend so much time on reg, C, E, B, Z, and all the rest, and we could work on whether the AI agent was being done properly.
Keith, maybe tell me if I'm oversimplifying this. The core questions are, who gets to borrow money, and how much is it going to cost them? How do we make AI better, more fair at making those decisions than we are right now?
So who gets to borrow, right? And then understanding their ability to pay, right? The extension of credit and the availability of credit for those that have the ability to pay, to keep that equilibrium. And then there's a lot of discussion about the biases in that system, and it is still being kind of rooted out. We go through extensive process with the oversight functions internally within the company, our internal audit, and our regulators to evidence the way that data is being utilized in terms of protected classes, like we discussed earlier, and others. I do think,
and maybe it's even their determination to pay, or their community's determination to pay, even above their ability.
That's right.
As we've seen in some of the models we were talking about earlier.
That's
outside
right.
the U.S.
That's right. Beyond ability, obviously willingness and so forth that are related to how they're managing kind of their household finances and so forth, right? I mean, to the extent that we can continue to learn more about those behavioral patterns in such a way that it creates even more equitable access to credit, That's a goal to strive for.
But that's going to require probably a different type of data if we're going to open up access than we've had before. Like if we're looking at some of these community finance models where it's like, okay, well, we know if this person can't pay, then their church community or their entrepreneur community is going to be sure to pitch in because everybody's reputation, right, is tied together with this person. Do we need to be prepared if we want to open up access in an era of AI-driven data hunger to open up the opportunity for people to contribute different sorts of data to help institutions like yours make a different kind of decision about who gets to borrow?
I think that's absolutely the way we should think about it, right? I mean, right now, much of credit decisioning is driven off of the data that comes from the bureaus, right? The three kind of credit bureaus that have been capturing credit history for so long. And there's been extensions currently into cash flow underwriting, the ability to better understand for persons that are slightly outside of that system that maybe aren't participating in the bureaus, but there is cash flow and that lends itself to kind of an underwriting decision that would extend credit. And then further extensions like you're describing, how could we generate data that could make that into a systematic decisioning process so that you could further extend?
I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment, so there's your early warning. But if I don't see any, I'm going to blow right through it and keep asking questions because one of my favorite things to do. Nicole, we failed on this with PCs on the web, and to me, the evidence is what happened during COVID in schools, right? We talk about digital divide often in the context of education. We've raised it in the context of the financial system. And very clearly, we've been talking about the digital divide for as long as broadband has been around and before, and the importance of closing
Presidential administrations.
Yeah, hand out laptops and library access, blah, blah, blah. None of that worked during the pandemic because the kids, either from higher income households who had higher access to technology or from households that, for whatever cultural reasons, were valuing education more highly, actually did better in some cases being isolated from the traditional environment where, oh my goodness, the drop-off in other communities was huge. The same thing's going to happen, won't it, in an AI-driven environment unless something changes?
And I want to respond a little bit to your first question as well, your last question as well. So one of the things that we have to be we have to acknowledge is that any type of AI that sits on fractured, broken systems, institutional, structural systems, is going to perform the way in which that system is. So I like the idea of thinking about microfinance models and alternative ways to credit, but we haven't fixed the challenge of wealth creation and credit allocation to people who have been systematically denied the opportunity to participate in this economy. So I think it's really important that we have that conversation because some of the AI biases that we're seeing are biases like, my dear friend Aaron, I quote this still to this day, if you use a PC, you're more likely to get in Mac, you're more likely to get credit than if using a PC because of the assumption that you paid more. LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard. If your name is Shaquita Wan or something that is racially ethnic sounding, you're less likely denied credit because there's an assumption that you come from a cultural group. When I got started in this work, financial services was the first place I went when I started thinking about bias. In one regards, the financial services industry is highly regulated. And so the type of quantitative modeling and the litmus tests that are actually there to avoid any type of discriminatory disparate impact is clearly evident in the regulatory process that is in the financial services system. But what we've been able to do with AI, particularly generative AI, is go around those and create more backdoors. We don't use proxies like address, but we use these intersectional proxies. I always give the example. I'm a huge shopper. I love to buy tweed jackets. If you see me in another panel, I'll probably be wearing another one. The internet knows that based on ad recommendations. I have children. I stay up at night. I buy tweed jackets. I buy stuff for my children. The internet knows that. And over time, it develops a composite profile that perhaps I'm overspending. And over time, it realizes I might be a parent. My point is that these biases are baked throughout the whole process. So we have to really interrogate that. To your point about education, I think you're completely right. I mean, the path for economic and social mobility for students was having the internet. The path for the same thing that we're going to see in financial services is having a device that allows you to be much more connected to these digital systems that allow for greater financial inclusion. So I do agree with you. Like, I fear that we're basically seeing AI play out where it's regressing some of the progress because we're, in many respects, taking the trade-off of the incentive to get people connected and not really interrogating what's wrong with the system, right? And we really need to have that conversation when we begin to think about what does alternative credit look like? Why do I have to go to my church if I actually have the same income? Who really sees, and this is one where some might disagree with me, who really sees buy now, pay later? Because you're never really sitting with the person next to you to see if that is actually showing up as a way for you to have credit at that time. We live in an internet that is very personal and very one-to-one, right? We don't see the type of collective impact that you're discussing, and we also don't have people at the table building these products and services who represent the lived experiences of the problems that we're trying to solve. And so, yeah, I think to your point, it's a conundrum of all facets, but fortunately, I think we're getting better in actually calling out and making bias more normative. We really need to dig more sectorally to have these discussions with partners on an interdisciplinary scale so we can make sense of it.
We're talking dangers of AI in finance. We haven't yet hit upon the dangers from attacks, but do we have any questions right now on that? I see one.
Sorry, my question about your buy now, pay later. We see a lot of fintechs trying to shake it up and not use things like FICO and the FICO score that we've been talking about, which we know has years of bias in the system itself. And then we watch the CFPB take a look at buy now, pay later, and then they're like, wait, they aren't using FICO, they're not credit reporting, that's harming consumers as well. Like, where's the balance with the regulators and the inventive new ways to try and approach things to shake up the system and do something in a way that's different and not relying on those old data sets?
Yeah, I love it because, you know, we're Discover, like, we made a choice to actually not lean into the buy now, pay later as a product offering. And we're in conversations back with the credit bureaus because those institutions are not reporting into those systems. And so I know I have consumers and customers that are experiencing stress, right? They're carrying a debt load that is beyond what we can normally see. And so how we manage our delinquency and how we manage the profiles in our models, it has a variable that's outside of our ability to see that, which is difficult to kind of manage and of course regulate.
Other questions? Here.
Hi, thank you. My question is, you all have mentioned regulation in increasingly regulated entities and education. Both of them lack technology quite significantly. So what's your thought on designing these systems? I don't mean the tech systems, but designing these products with a little bit more intentionality.
Jen, do you want to?
Well, you're on my favorite subject if you're talking about the regulator's own technology capacity to enter into a new generation. And we think one of the things that isn't discussed enough is that the regulators are going to have to transform their own technology, including their own talent and their cultures, and move into the digital age. You know, they're going to be dealing with novel risk, faster evolving risk than we're used to, mold-breaking risk. And they're going to need more information, and they're going to need to use AI to analyze it and get early warning of these emerging risks. So we think they need to undertake. There's actually a bill that has passed the House Financial Services Committee that would, I think it's called the Futures Act. It would require the regulators to self-assess their readiness to oversee the tech transformation of finance in terms of their own technology, and a bipartisan bill passed the committee unanimously. I think we're going to have to fundamentally change.
Joanne? Like, it seems to me, and I don't cover the military-industrial complex, but this doesn't seem to be a problem over there, right? Like them being able to use the best technology in government in order to do what they need to do. Why is it so much a problem on the finance side?
That's a great question, and we wonder about that sometimes. There is more tech in the security arena and military arena than there is. And sometimes the rules are different, but sometimes the rules are the same, but they've been interpreted and used differently. I think there are a lot of, and of course there's a downside risk to it as well. Everything we're talking about here has downside risks, but I think there really needs to be a deep rethinking. The regulators are going to have to move faster. And again, speaking as a former deputy controller of the currency, you know, regulators like to be careful, and it's a feature, not a bug. You know, they're supposed to be risk averse and cautious and get things right, but they're still going to have to go faster, and it's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah. Do I see another? Okay, last one. Then we'll move on to opportunities, because I don't want to be all doom and gloom.
Yeah, I'm trying to dig in a little bit more on the question of how do you apply these models to fair lending in a way that's not discriminatory. And yesterday, Lisa Rice talked about how they've been using fair play to basically say, is it better than FICO? And Aaron talked about that this morning too. Can we? I know many people in the market want to have more clarity. Well, can we use this? So is that something we can say, yes, that's a standard, let's get going on it, because it's versus we can't make a decision about anything?
So I think on the case of whether or not there's a green light on this technology, you're completely right. So just for the credit of the Biden administration, we have seen a series of policies come out that are one, rights-based with regards to consumer action and agency over decisions that are made by autonomous decision-making models. Then we've seen this resiliency factor within government, where we're seeing government really sit back from the Office of Budget Management and say, hey, who's your chief AI officer? Who's doing this work? Blah, blah, blah. And then we have this conversation around, well, should we be so cautious that we can't use it? And this goes back to the prior question around some of the technologies and your question that have evolved from the internet and the extent to which, yeah, it's not the best, but we are seeing people engage differently in the marketplace. I think the key thing is you have to have at least some congressional heft on this, which we haven't seen. That's the problem, right? Congress has to help us come in and give us some guidance on what we're regulating, which goes a lot to the previous question in terms of their capacity. But I think that there's some norms that we can all agree on. What is transparency? We do transparency very well in the financial services marketplace, but yet we don't see how the existing analog transparency requirements apply to the digital space. So we have to have that conversation, right? What are some of those consumer protections that really have translatable activity within the digital space? And let's be okay saying that, right? We have not yet really said, it's not fair to take advertising and exclude people of color because it violates fair housing laws. We implicitly believe that that's the case, but no one has really come out and said, hey, these laws actually do apply. Please build to them. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is also having stakeholders at the table who understand the problem. One of the things, I'm a sociologist, I'm not a computer scientist. So one of the things I've always found is that the people who are actually dictating the rules on technology are technologists. They are not as familiar with our compliance requirements. They are not as familiar with stakeholder history. They don't understand the trauma that various verticals have caused different consumers. But they do the products. They get the most time to be heard. And then they sort of break it and come back and try to fix it. And at the same time, these types of nuances have the effect to change our whole global market. I cannot stress enough to this audience how proud I was to write a paper around, derivatives and trading and AI, because that's an area we don't even talk about because it is even more opaque than the retail services side of financial services. So to your point, I think people are not saying don't use it, but I think there is a thirst for folks to have some principle-based norms which allow us to say, here are places where this makes sense. Here are places where they don't make sense. But we need the discoverers and others to sit at the table with the technologists because they have much more behavioral guidance on these issues than the people who are building these products.
Maybe just for a minute. I certainly welcome the conversation. I would say that the good news is that at a firm like Discover, at least, the role that I have, which is essentially the Chief Data and Analytics Officer, is with an express purpose to have a sense of governance on the usage of machine learning and AI across the firm. And I think the operating models inside of many of these companies is evolving because we've all been going through our challenges on risk and compliance and the regulatory cycles. And there is, there's definite learnings that's happening through that. And so the operating models are evolving with a sense of a stronger kind of federated structure where there's a stronger center on the platforms and the tools and technologies. But then how does it get out to the endpoint where it's kind of being used at a marketing context or a fraud context or a credit context, right? So the good news maybe for the room is that there is work inside of the different firms, and I've not just at Discover, but I talked to some of my peers about how we have a better kind of organizational model to combat or kind of handle some of these notions.
I actually want to move on, and we can touch on some of these same points in this next section, but I do want to get to the opportunities. And Joanne, I want to start with you, because if I'm looking at what technology has done for consumers where money is concerned, and I'm looking for success stories, and I'm really looking at the working class, I think about e-commerce and the broadening of possibilities on price discovery and just variety. And then I think about the gig economy and the ability not to have to depend on just the employers who are in, but to be self-employed, providing a service in a given area. There are more opportunities there. So is there a need, is there a possibility, as AI enters the picture in financial services, for it to have a similar impact as a consumer good, not as burgers, not as broccoli? Like, you know what I mean? Because people don't get excited about saving the way we wish or investing unless it's crazy risky. People aren't contributing enough often to their 401ks or understand what an IRA is. So
I love the question. I'll say again, I think there's a possibility that the core dilemmas that financial consumers face can be greatly ameliorated with AI. We're not going to have, nirvana. But why do people have trouble with their financial lives other than lack of money, which is the fundamental issue? But, it's a lack of education, financial education, it's a lack of access, it's a lack of being able to afford a given product, it's an inability to qualify for a product. Go down the whole list. We've been trying to solve this problem for more than a half century through methods like disclosure, mandatory disclosures, and consumer education. And I hate to say it, they're both good. We should have them both, but neither of them work. They don't. I spent 2 years at Harvard researching these issues a few years ago. They just are not effective. People need better tools that can get more information and apply it to their own individual situation. And, it's not going to be perfect at the start, but eventually I believe it's going to really help. I want to say one other thing, too. I think we should think more about the potential of AI to solve these bias problems, not just to cause them. There's no doubt that there's a lot of bias that the AI can invent and can learn from human systems that are already biased as they ingest information. But what if we were using AI in our, say, bank examinations for fair lending to look for more data, more sophisticated analysis that could find out that the FICO information, for example, it is predictive, but it's also, we know it's got plenty of disparate impact. What if we could more finely tune these risk models? And what if the bank examiner was holding a tool like that? These tools already exist in the private sector, and could go in and say you're inadvertently discriminating against creditworthy people because you're using old technology and limited data that is full of historic bias. We can do better.
Keith, do we have the right incentives to do that as fast as we should?
Do we have the right incentives? We certainly have the market incentives to grow the business, and that's by making kind of more product available. But as we think about the maybe a little bit of the example right? So why can't we make the kind of the individual consumer more interested in kind of managing their finances, right? That there's just too many messages from DraftKings. There's too many messages from those things that are out kind of in a predatory fashion that are sending that ad for the tweed jacket that you want that makes it super compelling for you to spend a little bit more than maybe you should, right? And so how do we build some resistance into that, and then have incentive spending on that second jacket or on that DraftKings parlay, saving a little bit more and building that into your kind of household structure, right? That's the dilemma.
Is there a role for government in creating an environment that's more likely to incentivize good behavior?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, one of the areas that, although Congress is sort of stuck on what they should actually adopt as policy, one area that I think should have overwhelming bipartisan agreement is AI literacy, right? Because you can start to unpack where AI makes sense and how you can interject it into like financial education.
It feels like we've already lost that, though.
But we did,
Did you see
but we
the
need
Met Gala
something.
AI fake photos?
I know.
Even Katy Perry's mom thought she was there, and she was not there.
But see, this is the problem. Like, I think we're missing the mark because I like to think of it this way. We are conflating a lot in these discussions, right? The role of AI for efficiency and the ways in which the AI is disrupting the ways in which we organize certain sectors. What does that look like for work? What does that look like for processing? What's the utility of the AI to just do things better, to help us with areas which required, a team of 10, now maybe with 2, we could actually do this. And then there's this AI for your question for good, right? What are the social outputs? And how do we make the distinction between efficiency and what these potential harms are when it comes to, the agency of users, the way in which companies have certain compliance factors in place, how government actually looks at these issues and enforces them. We're losing that second battle. I think we're doing a really good job when it comes to procurement. We've got new products and services that are revolutionizing different sectors, but the government is losing the battle on where do people pick up the agency when these technologies go wrong? So to your point, I'm a huge believer that AI can be used in ways to help us advance, equity. That AI has the ability to help us granularly find things like disparity that shows up in credit decisions. But I get nervous when I think about the data that is training the AI, because we haven't had really bold conversations on representative data sets, whether or not we're creating inclusive data sets, whether or not we're creating regulatory sandboxes, which this industry has done quite well in the past to determine whether or not bias is affecting people in a certain way. I get concerned about things like that because when I think to your question, the areas in which we could actually excel for AI for the good, they're not happening because of these technical considerations that are still being sort of debated and dialogue through, our agencies. Like NIST has a great AI risk management framework. I can assure you there are a lot of people who just don't know about that framework in a variety of verticals. So my point is, we have to do some deliberate workshopping of some of these tools. But again, I think we have to do them in context where people are sitting down with experts who work in the space, who can help, with equity issues and all those other things.
Keith, it looked like you might want to jump in here now.
Well, I think, when we talk about AI, and I assume we're talking about the generative AI piece of it, right? Those large language models are trained on very large data sets that have a lot of, they have bias, they have toxic data and so forth in them. But I think you started to hear today about, there's the technology and the approach has a couple layers to it, and you can build there's a notion called fine tuning, which is a secondary model that can be built on smaller data sets, or you'll hear kind of small language models, which can be, those data sets can be generated and crafted to be able to be observant for bias, and then they can be applied post the usage of the general kind of large language model. So there's technical mechanisms. We simply have to get together with the will to create that data in a way that we understand it and we can kind of validate it from what we want it to measure. If it's a bias measurement, if it's some other measurement, like there's ways to do this. We have to kind of get the folks together to do it.
Well, and if
Hold on one second. I want to open it up to questions on opportunities. I see one here in the front.
Thank you. Kind of related to opportunities, but also related to the risks. And really where I see kind of AI, tech, and finance meet is with cloud service providers. And so the question I have is about the third-party risk management process. We heard yesterday a little bit about concentration risk concerns and a digital divide between large institutions and small institutions. So I'm curious, any thoughts in terms of what can be done in order to make that oversight or third-party risk management of cloud providers better in order to address a lot of these risks and issues that you've talked about?
Joanne, do you have any thoughts on that?
I just got off an airplane to come over here, so I didn't hear yesterday's discussion, but was the concern that the cloud providers themselves, their processes are biased? Was that the...
Well, one was that there's just a concentration of cloud providers.
Yep.
And it's very difficult for firms to oversee a cloud service provider.
Yeah. So my comment on that is there's a lot of work to do to address those issues, and I think it should be going faster than it is, candidly. But going back to being more a tech optimist, when we get this whole industry into cloud computing, we will have better financial services. It's more efficient. We are doing a project right now on minority depository institutions, which are very, very small banks and credit unions, and they can't afford the technology that they need to stay competitive in what a customer expects today or to be efficient in their back office. To get there, the whole industry has to go into a cloud environment where if you're doing it right, the security will actually be better, and the efficiency, you'll just be using the computing power you're needing, and you can upgrade it and update it instead of having to make a whole new capital investment to modernize your technology. So therefore, we need to solve the issues that you're talking about, the concentration. There needs to be, I think, for financial companies, oversight that reaches to the cloud as well.
I think a little bit of the context of the conversation yesterday was it was almost interpreted like the institutions are kind of using the models from the cloud providers, and and therefore we're all going to be kind of in some sense using the same models, right? Microsoft is with OpenAI, which is under in ChatGPT. Amazon has their model, Bedrock, and so forth. And I think the piece as a practitioner is that we certainly use the cloud providers, but many of the institutions, I think, are building their own models, and therefore they're fine-tuning them to their data. We start with maybe a base model, but then there's still a proliferation of work that happens that I think gets a little bit ahead of, the more risk would be, if I was on a single cloud platform, and of course, if that cloud provider gets compromised, it can kind of take down from a cybersecurity perspective. So we have risk management structures on multiple cloud providers and kind of versions of the technology to try to mitigate that. But I think it's something that as folks learn more and more about how the technology actually works, can have a deeper understanding.
And if I can just add to that, I wasn't here yesterday, but I think that's a great question because this challenge of AI is moving into a computing conversation, right? It's really going to be, computing is going to be the end all as to where we go with this technology. But to your point, and this is pointing back to the regulator question, third parties are becoming a little bit more dangerous in the supply chain, right, when it comes to certainty and standards. And so we are seeing the work that I was just finishing up with the CFTC. We have a whole section on third-party risk management, right, because many of those backhaul systems are not necessarily transparent, right, to retail services in terms of how they're doing stuff, how they're collecting stuff. And just a couple weeks ago, I was at a panel on market and competition, which I heard the commissioner talk about just prior to this. We're also having the challenge of the same cloud computing companies and the same third-party companies selling the same data to a variety of companies, which could end up with collusion, or some type of price fixing that we're not aware of, simply because they become the go-to for how we standardize these technical products and services. So I think for regulators, that's a really good area for them to at least not necessarily impose regulation, but to do some listening sessions, gain some guidance on that, because they do tend to be much more obscure in the conversation. So I'm really glad it was brought up, because that is something that we really don't talk about when we begin to talk about the retail services side of this business.
We got time for one or two more questions. Here in the middle.
So something that's been in the news or in the past week is this idea of a flexible credential. And so I imagine it as like, I go to pay for something with my flexible Discover card, and if I don't have the money in my account, instead of going to my debit, it goes to my credit, so I don't get an overdraft fee. Keith, are there any other products or services you all are looking at that has like a clear consumer use case where AI is involved and can just benefit me?
It's a fun conversation. I love the framing of it, right? I mean, the concept of a credit card, which is essentially an open line of credit that you have access to. The concept of buy now, pay later, right? Which is essentially a micro credit transaction over a short period of time. And then the concept of like a personal loan, right? I take out a fixed end personal loan for maybe debt consolidation, right? And the real difference between those three ideas is just some sense of the amount of credit and the time, the unit of time that you're wanting to kind of participate with the money. And so they evolved as separate products, mostly just because of the historical context of the way things came up. But will it move into a flexible kind of credit authentication or authorization, and will it be tied to cash flow or assets in a way that you can flex up and flex down? I think it's a really interesting space to think about, because they've evolved as separate products, but the boundaries are starting to blur.
Did you want to?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's an interesting concept, and it gets at some of the things we talked about earlier, but I still, I worry, right? Because we still have to figure out ways in which we offer these incentives online where they're very transparent, that some people can participate in this, some people can't. I think that's part of the challenge, right? The internet has become a one-to-one transaction. And AI has allowed that to evolve in ways that there's no accountability, there's no one, at least if you don't get a FICO, a credit decision is made and you're going under FICO, you're going to find out what the adverse consequences were and which of those areas were the reason why you were denied credit. These other spaces, we're not sure. You see what I mean? And so it's an area where I think, again, having these conversations on how we're just addressing some of these disparities historically that we have seen when it comes to creditworthiness and allocation, and doing it in a creative way that also honors it from an equity lens. That is a really hard space to be in, but I think it's one that will benefit the AI, have the AI benefit people, versus the marketplace in ways that, will have, I think, effects on our economy that we'll have to recover.
I would add, I think it's going to get more and more easy to have your phone probably set to what you want it to be, so that it's automatically saving for you, it's automatically alerting you if you're buying one too many tweed jackets and whatever. And you'll probably be able to have an avatar that can be talking to you about it if you want to, make it easy for you. Another consumer benefit use case potentially is evolving around privacy and digital identity, and more ability to control how your identity is being used. So there's a lot of work underway to, a lot of people around the world don't have an official identity and therefore can't get into the financial system. You can't get a bank account if you can't prove who you are, which is a huge financial exclusion force globally. In the United States, we have some of that problem, but we also have because we've had pretty good identity systems over the years for most people, we've gotten complacent about it, and we're not focusing on the fact that all our information is for sale on the dark web, folks, And the people who are using it are very increasingly sophisticated. So we're going to need technological solutions for that. And we're going to be able to set the identity information so that you can just, instead of handing over your whole birth date and address and everything to some clerk at a store to prove you're over 21, you'll be able to just, get a yes/no type thing. Yes, this person is eligible to do what they're trying to do with their identity.
Keith,
Zero knowledge proof.
you touched on something, Joanne, that I want to just open up a little bit. Over the past decade especially, it seems like technologies leading up to AI have opened up hacking as more of an industry where you don't need to have skills. You can get a whole, cloud package, SaaS driven, where, you can figure it out yourself and we'll do the hard work behind the scenes and all you have to do is go out there and execute.
Yeah, there's even a phrase, crime as a service now.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
There are videos on YouTube and TikTok of how to defraud a bank. I mean, there's literally folks out there that'll take you step by step, like this is how you go to this place, you can get this kind of detail about an identity, and then you go here and you assemble it, and then you can step it forward, right? It is an active space.
Right, and if I can add, so I recently got appointed to Secretary Marcus's Homeland Security AI Safety Board. And interestingly enough, we'll be looking at critical infrastructure. But one of the areas that is of significant importance to the Secretary, and I think the people who sit on this board, tech folks, governors, is AI security from the financial sector. Because I have a 17-year-old. She keeps everything on her phone, right? And she said to me the other day, just put it all on your phone, Mommy. It's okay. You can do Apple Pay and all that stuff. And I'm terrified, right? Because if I lose my phone, I forget my password. I don't know about many of you. I'm up at that age that I just cannot remember my password all the time, right? That everything is on this device. And even though there are protections behind it, individually, I'm going down if it gets lost. But one of the areas that I think we have to continue to talk about is cybersecurity. I mean, it kind of gets lost in these discussions. And you said this earlier when we set up this conversation. There are different verticals of dialogue happening, right? There are dialogues in terms of AI as it gets closer to the consumer, AI in terms of government use, AI in terms of, technology and cadence. But we need to really look at these verticals like financial services, education, healthcare as national security concerns. And they tend to sort of get pushed to the side when you talk about defense as those things that, one super manipulative chatbot could take out a whole trading system. And also the context, and we brought it up with certain social media platforms, the misinformation that is often driven by the vulnerabilities in our social networks could also drive our markets to a place of despair. Right. And so I think it's really important to start adding that to the dialogue, right? So that we're talking about the ecosystem in which financial services live.
Keith, and then Joanne, final thoughts.
One quick comment for the group. Certainly, you think about the cybersecurity at kind of the systemic or kind of the state actor level, but just the individual frauds. We were talking a little bit about fraudsters. My quick reminder to this whole room: the elderly are really struggling with the technology, and the fraudsters are very clever with reaching out and calling, and the elderly are they like the fact that they're talking to somebody, right? So I see so many cases coming through of folks that have maxed out their Discover card. They're in the middle of a scam. The scammer is asking them to buy gift cards and mail them, and they're maxing out their credit line, and then it's wrecking their credit. And so if you all do not have two-factor authentication, and you're not managing the elderly parents and so forth in your lives, strongly recommend it.
That ecosystem.
That's right. Joanne, final thoughts?
The only way we're going to protect those folks is they're going to need an AI protector, seriously. Because we're going to have to build something that could catch that, because people are not, people are flawed. I think the final thought that I'll offer, I see we're out of time, is just that our regulators, I'm second to none in my admiration and affection for the regulators. I'm sure there's lots in the room here. My son became a bank examiner. I love regulators. But Regulators are working with tiny fragments of information. They're sampling files to figure out what to look at in a bank exam. The bank regulators are relying on call reports, which are quarterly reports to understand the health of the banking system. The securities regulators have more data and more tech, I would think, in general. But we're going to have to equip people with lots of real-time, full-set information, or close to real-time, and let them really analyze it to understand where the risks are coming from.
Joanne, Keith, Nicole, thank you.
Thank you.